You ever sit at your kitchen table in the early morning coffee gone cold, toast untouched, and wonder how much of what you were taught was ever really true? We were raised to believe in order, in trust, in the sanctity of certain places and people, churches, priests, habits and crosses. But what if I told you that the holiest-looking man in town was the one who carried the deepest rot? That behind stained glass and morning prayers, some of the darkest crimes were committed and buried deep for decades. Welcome to Grandma's Stories. My name is Madeline. I'm 70 now, and this story isn't easy to tell. But it's time. For the women who can't speak anymore. For those who still live with silence. If you're listening and believe in the power of truth, subscribe to this channel. Share it. Leave a comment that says I believe. Not for me, for them. Now, sit down. This one will shake the ground under your feet. It was a Sunday afternoon, not unlike today, when everything inside me began to crack. I was scrubbing the kitchen floor of my little house in rural Maine, the scent of lemon cleaner strong in the air, the radio humming with old gospel hymns. My knees hurt, as they always did these days, and the arthritis in my knuckles had flared up again. But it wasn't the pain that stopped me. It was the news bulletin. Just one sentence tucked between the weather and a church bake sale. Monsignor Jonas Bell of the St. Helena Parish in Massachusetts will be honored next month for 50 years of service to the church. I dropped the scrub brush, just like that. 50 years. I stood frozen on that cold tile floor, my palms soaked, my breath tight in my chest. My mind didn't stay in the kitchen. It flew back to 1973, to that hilltop convent and the way the morning fog wrapped the stone walls like God's hand. But God wasn't there. Not then. That night, I opened the box I hadn't touched in years. It was hidden beneath a loose board under my bed. Inside, brittle letters, a broken rosary, a small journal wrapped in a cloth embroidered with a faded cross. And just like that, the voices returned. The faces. The promises. And the silence. I was 17 when I arrived at St. Helena's convent. My hair was still long then, dark as molasses. I remember tying it back nervously as the gates closed behind me, the sound sharp like a verdict. I wasn't scared. Not yet. I was filled with purpose, like a soldier reporting for duty. This was what I had chosen. A life of service. Prayer. Meaning. They called me Sister Madeline. The convent was perched at the edge of a sleepy New England town called Rosefield. It wasn't on any tourist map, and even the locals rarely drove up that winding hill unless it was for confession or bread. We baked loaves twice a week. Sister Agnes's sourdough was legendary and handed them out to the poor. There were 6 of us living behind those walls. We called each other sisters, and for a while we really believed it. There was Sister Helen, the quiet one, with a voice like rain on a window pane. Sister Claire, who could sew a wedding gown out of old curtains. Sister Louise, our fiery cook who didn't care what the rulebook said as long as the soup tasted right. Sister Anna, youngest of all, just turned 19, eyes like bruised violets. And of course, our Mother Superior, Margaret, tall and stern, with hands that could both cradle and command. And me, the observer. The girl who didn't speak much but saw everything. Our days were predictable. Dawn prayers, garden work, scripture, silence. But it wasn't heavy at first. The rhythm of it brought a strange peace, the kind that seeps into your bones. I slept deeply. I didn't miss the outside world. That changed when he arrived. Father Jonas Bell was 35 when he was assigned to our parish. A rising star, they said. Educated in Rome. Charismatic. People called him the Golden Priest. He had a voice like velvet and eyes that lingered too long. At first, we were flattered by his attention. He brought books. New candles for the chapel. Seeds for the garden. He smiled often. But never with his eyes. The first time I felt something wrong, it was during confession. I remember the way he asked me questions not about sin but about my childhood. My thoughts at night, my body. His words were slow, deliberate. I thought maybe I was imagining it, but I wasn't. Sister Anna started to avoid him. She used to sing as she watered the basil. She stopped singing, her eyes dimmed. I found her one night sitting on the chapel floor, hands trembling. When I asked if she was all right, she said nothing. And that silence screamed. We were supposed to trust him. He wore the collar. He offered us communion. But I started to keep note-states, times, things he said that didn't feel right. I hid them behind my mattress. I wanted to believe it was just a mistake. A misunderstanding. That maybe I was broken for even thinking such things. But then one afternoon, I walked into the library and saw him standing too close to Anna. His hand on her wrist, her back pressed against the bookcase, his face calm, hers not. And just like that I knew. The devil didn't have horns. He wore vestments and smiled with his teeth. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I did neither. I waited. I watched. I wrote it all down. Because part of me still believed someone would listen if only I brought the truth the right way. They didn't. The next few weeks blurred into one another. Anna became thinner. Her laugh disappeared. Sister Helen kept her distance. The others whispered, but no one said anything out loud. Not yet. One night, I woke to the sound of sobbing. I followed it down the hallway to the pantry. There, in the dark, I found Anna. Her habit was torn at the shoulder. Her cheek was flushed red. She looked at me, wide-eyed and broken. He said, "If I told, God would strike me down," she whispered. And that's when I knew we were on our own. We were just girls. Girls who gave up the world to follow a calling, only to find the monster wasn't outside the gates, it lived among us. And now, it's time you know the rest. When you live behind stone walls long enough, you start to believe they're keeping the world out. But I learned the hard way they were only keeping us in. After that night in the pantry, I didn't sleep. I lay in my narrow bed listening to the wind press against the window panes like something trying to get in. But it wasn't the wind I feared. It was the silence inside those walls. A silence so deep it swallowed the truth before it ever had a chance to live. I wanted to go to Mother Margaret. I rehearsed it over and over in my head. How I'd start gently. How I'd explain what I'd seen. But every time I imagined her face, it stayed cold, unreadable. I didn't trust it would go the way I needed. Still, the next morning, I knocked on her door. She was sitting at her desk with a stack of letters, the light from the stained glass window throwing pale colors across her hands. She didn't look up right away, just said, "Come in," as if I were a child late for chores. I stood there, unsure. Then I said it. Not all of it, just the part I thought would land softly. "Mother, I'm concerned about Sister Anna." That got her attention. She looked up, her lips pressed into a line. "Concerned how?" He swallowed hard. "She seems frightened lately, with Father Jonas. I think something's wrong." Her brow furrowed. "But not in sympathy. What are you suggesting?" I hesitated. "That maybe his visits are unsettling for some of us." There was a pause. Then her voice cut through the quiet like a blade. "Are you accusing a priest of misconduct?" I flinched. I don't know. I just think something isn't right." She stood then, slowly, her eyes never leaving mine. "Sister Madeline," she said, her voice clipped, "your duty is to pray, to serve, and to trust in the guidance of those God has placed above you. Do you understand?" I nodded, though everything inside me screamed no. "I think you need to spend more time in reflection," she added. "Perhaps in the garden. Fresh air may clear your thoughts." Dismissed. Just like that. I left her office with my heart pounding, shame creeping up my neck. Shame not for what I'd said, but for knowing now that we were truly alone. That afternoon, I found Anna in the garden, kneeling among the cabbages, her fingers covered in soil. I sat beside her, not saying anything at first. She didn't look up. "He's still coming," she said finally, her voice flat. I nodded. I tried. She wouldn't hear it. "I told you," she said. "They never do." I didn't ask what he'd done. I didn't need to. Her eyes said more than words ever could. That night, we ate in silence. The chapel bells rang, the prayers were said, and the world kept turning as if nothing had shifted. But everything had. In the days that followed, Father Jonas's visits grew more frequent, always with a reason. A question about the altar cloths, a concern over scripture lessons. He floated through the convent like incense, thick and hard to escape. The other sisters began to change. Sister Claire, who once hummed while she sewed, now kept her eyes on the floor. Sister Helen grew sharper, more watchful. Even Sister Louise, who'd never been afraid of anyone, grew quiet when he entered a room. He was always polite. always smiling. But the air changed when he was near. And we all felt it. One evening, I went to the library hoping for solitude. It was late, nearly time for lights out. I moved through the shelves, tracing spines with my fingers, letting the scent of old pages soothe my nerves. Then I heard it. A voice, low, urgent. I stepped closer and froze. Behind one of the shelves I saw Sister Claire standing stiffly. Father Jonas was speaking softly to her, too softly to hear every word, but I caught pieces. Your devotion, obedience is love. She didn't speak, just stood there like a statue, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. When he reached to touch her shoulder, I stepped out from the shelf. The sound startled them both. Father, I said evenly, supper's being served. He turned to me, face smooth as glass. Thank you, Sister Madeline, he said, as if nothing had happened. Claire walked past me without a word. I followed her down the hall. She didn't look back. Didn't speak, but when she reached her room, I saw her pause, her shoulders trembling. She closed the door slowly, as if afraid to make noise. That night, I opened my journal again. I began writing everything down. Not just dates, but expressions, places, phrases he used, patterns. The way he touched, the way he watched. It wasn't enough to suspect anymore. I needed to see it laid out. Black on white. So that when the time came, if it ever came, I'd have more than just a feeling. 2 weeks passed. Then something happened I didn't expect. Sister Louise came to me during kitchen duty. She was chopping carrots. I was rolling dough. Without looking up, she said, "He's cornering them, isn't he?" I froze. My hands stopped moving. "Yes," I whispered. "I heard him with Helen, last night, her room." I looked at her. Her eyes stayed on the knife. "What are we going to do?" she asked. The question hung there between us. Not if. Not maybe. What now? That was the first time I felt something other than fear. I felt voor. Real, shaking, bone-deep anger. But it wasn't loud. It was quiet. Focused. Cold. We made a pact that day. Not a spoken one. Just a glance across the flour-dusted table. We were going to find the truth. And if no one believed us, we'd find a way to make them. We started small. I asked questions that didn't seem like questions. Louise watched patterns, who he spoke to, when, where. We wrote down times, places, words. Then one afternoon, everything changed. I came back early from market duty. The front hall was quiet, too quiet. I heard voices coming from the chapel. One was his. The other Anna's. I stepped to the side door, careful not to make a sound. The heavy wooden panels didn't close all the way. Through the crack I saw her, standing stiff near the altar. He stood too close. "You mustn't question God's instruments," he said. "I'm not," she said, voice shaking. "You doubt me. You doubt him." Quote. She stepped back. He reached for her. That's when I pushed the door open. He turned, surprised. "Sister Madeline," he said smoothly. "Do you need something?" I looked at Anna. Her eyes begged me not to speak, so I didn't. "I just came to clean the candelabras," I said quietly. He smiled. "Of course. Such dedication." He walked past me slowly, and when he did, he leaned in. "Curiosity," he murmured, "can lead to sin." He didn't flinch. He left. Anna stood there, breath ragged. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. "I had to." She looked at me, really looked. "Then you need to understand something," she said, her voice low, urgent. "He isn't just dangerous. He's protected. They all know, and they let him stay." I felt the floor tilt under me. "What do you mean?" She hesitated. "Letters were sent, years ago. Complaints, disappearances. Nothing was done." I stepped back. My throat felt dry. "How do you know?" She swallowed. "My sister was at another convent. She tried to speak. She vanished. No one talks about it." A silence settled between us. "But you're not her," she said. "You're still here. You're still fighting." I looked at the altar, at the stained glass behind it, golden light pouring down like judgment. "Not for much longer," I said. And I meant it. The next time I opened my journal, I didn't just write what happened. I wrote what I was going to do. The storm didn't come from the sky. It began inside me. That night, I didn't pray. Not in the way I used to. I sat at the edge of my bed, holding the journal in my lap, and stared out the window at the chapel below. The steeple pierced the clouds like it was demanding answers from heaven. But I had stopped expecting answers a long time ago. I didn't need miracles. I needed truth, and the courage to carry it. I thought about what Anna had said, about the letters, the disappearances, the silence. I thought about Sister Helen's avoidance, Sister Claire's shrinking presence, and how the other women had started walking with their shoulders folded in, like the very walls were pressing down. We weren't just victims of a man. We were victims of a system that dressed him in holiness and called it virtue. The next morning, I skipped morning prayer. It wasn't rebellion. It was necessity. I went to the old supply shed near the edge of the garden. Most people had forgotten it existed. Its lock was rusted, and the door stuck. I forced it open with a heavy breath and stepped inside. Dust and old linens, crates of unused candles, a trunk in the corner. It was Anna who'd once told me about this place, said it had been used to store the convent's records before they were moved to the main house, but no one had ever cleared it out. Inside the trunk were papers, ledgers, birth certificates, even old letters sealed with wax. I sorted through them, eyes scanning names, dates, anything familiar. Then I found it. A folded page, yellowed, faint ink, a letter addressed to the diocese. It wasn't from our convent. It was from one across the state, a woman named Sister Eliza. She described unusual behavior from a visiting priest. No name. But her descriptions, they matched him. The way he asked invasive questions in confession, the way he lingered, the way she felt watched, even when alone. The letter had been stamped, received, but never answered. I sat back, the paper trembling in my hands. It wasn't just us. I carefully folded it and tucked it into the back of my journal. Then I went back inside as quietly as I had left. At lunch the air was brittle. Sister Claire sat across from me, her eyes shadowed, spooning broth without tasting it. I leaned closer. "Have you seen him again?" She nodded barely. I wanted to say something that would comfort her, but words felt useless. Instead, I slid a folded napkin across the table. Inside it, a note. 3 words. "You are not alone." She didn't look at it, just slipped it into her pocket. Later that evening, I returned to the library. It was the only place I could breathe, the only room left untouched by him, or so I thought. As I reached for a hymnal on the highest shelf, something fell behind the books. A notebook, smaller than mine. I opened it. It wasn't mine. It was Helen's. Tightly written lines filled every page. Prayers, reflections, and near the end an entry that stopped my heart. Father Jonas asked me if I was tempted by impure thoughts, said temptation is a test, that if I trusted him he could guide me. He touched my hand, held it too long. I told him I was uncomfortable. He said discomfort was part of purification. I closed the book. So even Helen, who barely spoke, who seemed untouchable in her stillness, she wasn't spared either. Back in my room, I lit a candle and placed both notebooks side by side. This was no longer suspicion. This was proof. But what could I do with it? I didn't trust Mother Margaret. And the bishop? He hadn't visited in over a year. His letters, when they came, were full of pleasantries and praise, never substance. That night, I asked Louise to meet me in the laundry room. It was always empty after Vespers. She came in with her sleeves rolled, a towel still tucked into her waistband. Her face looked tired but alert. "What is it?" she asked. I showed her the letter, the notebooks, the notes. I told her everything, slowly, carefully. When I finished, she leaned against the wall and crossed her arms. "Well," she said, "we can't stay quiet anymore." It was the closest thing to a battle cry I'd ever heard from her. We came up with a plan. Not escape. Not yet. We'd document everything, record it, preserve it, in case we needed to send it beyond these walls. And we'd protect the others, as best we could. It started small. I adjusted the work schedules to ensure no one was ever alone with him. Louise volunteered to be present during his visits. Claire started spending more time in the library. Helen never went to confession again. He noticed. Of course he did. And like any man who had grown used to being feared, he didn't like it. One morning, I was in the chapel arranging flowers when he walked in, alone. He stood at the doorway, watching me. I didn't move. "Sister Madeline," he said, voice smooth. "You've been very industrious lately." I didn't respond. He stepped closer. "You know, there's something dangerous about a woman who forgets her place." Still, I said nothing. He leaned in, just enough for me to feel his breath. "Curiosity is the first crack in obedience, and disobedience is the beginning of ruin." Quote. I turned to face him, steady. "Maybe ruin is what sets us free." He blinked, just for a second, then smiled. "I'll pray for you." "I'd rather you didn't." He left, but the message was clear. He knew what we were doing, and he wasn't going to let it go. That night, I found my journal missing. I tore apart my room, the mattress, the drawers. Nothing. I sat on the floor, fists clenched, teeth aching from the pressure of my jaw. Hours later, I found it placed neatly beneath my pillow. It was a message. He could reach me whenever he wanted. The next day, I met Louise behind the garden wall. "I think he went through my things," I said. She nodded. "We're running out of time. We need help." "But from who?" And that's when we thought of him. Mr. Thomas, the groundskeeper who delivered supplies every week. Quiet, kept to himself. But he always lingered just a moment too long when Anna handed him the list, as if he wanted to say something, or hear something. We didn't trust easily anymore, but we had no other choice. So the next time he came, I waited by the gate. When he handed me the box of flour, I said it quietly. "Mr. Thomas, if someone asked for your help, would you listen?" He looked at me, long and steady. "I suppose that depends on the help." I held his gaze. "I need to get a message to someone outside." He nodded slowly. "I've seen what happens here," he said. "You're not the first." My breath caught. And just like that, the walls started to crack. There are moments when a simple nod, a quiet word, becomes louder than any sermon ever spoken. That was what Mr. Thomas gave mesalliant affirmation. No questions, no doubt. Just the look of a man who had seen enough to recognize truth without needing proof. After he left, I stood by the convent gate for a long time, my hands gripping the worn wooden post, my heart pounding harder than it should have. For the first time in weeks, something moved inside me that wasn't fear. It wasn't quite hope yet, but maybe the space where hope could begin. Inside, life carried on as if nothing had shifted. Bells rang, prayers were chanted, spoons clinked against bowls. But under it all, there was a tremor. Like the earth beneath our feet had begun to question the weight it had been asked to carry. Louise and I kept our distance during the day. Too much whispering would raise suspicion. Instead, we passed notes tucked into aprons, behind hymnals, under empty bread bins. We had learned how to speak without speaking. We weren't just gathering information anymore. We were building something. A record, a case, a kind of truth that could no longer be denied. I wrote letters, carefully worded, unsigned. I sealed them in plain envelopes and slipped them into the flour sacks Mr. Thomas took back to town. Each one told part of the story. What we'd seen, what we feared, what had happened to Anna, to Claire, to Helen. I never knew exactly who he gave them to. I never asked, and he never told me. That was part of the agreement. What I did know was that I was being watched. One evening, I returned to my room to find my wardrobe slightly ajar. Inside, my clothes had been moved subtly, but not by my hand. The tiny cross I always hung from the knob was gone. In its place was a torn page from a psalm, carefully folded, slipped between the hinges. "Deliver me, O Lord, from the hand of the wicked." I didn't tell Louise, not that night. She had enough to carry. But the message was clear. He knew I was moving, and he wanted me to stop. He didn't. If anything, I moved faster. A few nights later, while most of the convent slept, I crept into the small side hall where Sister Helen usually folded linens. The room was quiet. The windows cracked just enough to let in the scent of night rain. Helen sat on a low stool, her hands moving methodically over a white sheet. I sat beside her, careful not to startle her. "You knew," I said softly, "about him, before any of us did." She didn't stop folding, but her eyes grew wet. "I hoped I was wrong," she whispered. "Why didn't you say something?" She looked down at her hands. They trembled slightly. "Because I did once. A long time ago. Not here. Another convent, another priest. I was told to pray harder, that I was misinterpreting kindness. After that, I stopped speaking. The pain in her voice was so raw it made my throat burn. You're not misinterpreting anything now, I said. You were right, and we need you. She folded the sheet one last time, placed it carefully on the stack, and looked at me. What do you want me to do? Tell your story. Write it down. Add it to the journal. She hesitated, then nodded. I'll try. It wasn't much, but it was something. The days blurred again. Rain came. Then frost. Then more rain. We wore shawls at breakfast and stoked the chapel's old stove with bits of firewood saved from the garden shed. Father Jonas remained a constant shadow. He didn't confront me outright, but his presence became sharper, more deliberate. He spoke during prayer now, weaving words into the silence that felt aimed only at me. Blessed are the obedient, he said one morning, for they shall not be led astray. No one responded. But the pause in the room afterward was heavy. Then, one afternoon, everything broke open. Sister Claire didn't come to evening prayer. She was never late, never absent. We searched her room. Empty. We checked the garden, the chapel, the cellar. It was Helen who found her, in the old sacristy behind the main altar, huddled on the floor, shaking, her habit torn at the sleeve, her face ghostly pale. We brought her back to her room, wrapped her in blankets, held her hands while she cried without making a sound. Louise sat on the edge of the bed, her face hard. What happened? Claire didn't speak at first. Then finally she whispered, he said if I told, no one would believe me, that God would turn his face from me. I looked at Helen, then at Louise. No more, I said. We don't wait, we don't hide, we get out. Helen nodded. I'll come too. That surprised me. She had never hinted at leaving. You don't have to, I said. I stayed silent once, she said, and I've carried that silence for years. I won't carry it into my grave. We made a plan. It was simple, dangerous, but it was all we had. Mr. Thomas would help. He'd already arranged for us to leave unnoticed one night. He'd found an old contact, his cousin, a widow who lived up north near the border. She'd take us in, no questions asked. We picked a date. The first Friday of the new month. There would be rain, according to the almanac. Enough to drown our steps, hide the sound. Until then, we pretended nothing had changed. But everything had. Claire stayed in her room most days, her spirit drained. Helen began writing again. Louise stockpiled dry bread, bandages, a canteen. I memorized the layout of the back wall, where the ivy had grown thick and the stones had begun to loosen. Then came the knock. It was late, past curfew, past decency. I opened my door to find Mother Margaret standing there, her robe clutched tightly at her chest. We need to talk, she said. My heart thudded. She stepped inside without waiting. I know what you're doing, she said. I said nothing. I've known for a while. The notes, the whispers, you're planning to leave. I didn't lie. Not this time. Yes. She sighed, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked tired. Not stern, not cold, just worn. You're not wrong, she said quietly. About him. About what's been happening. He blinked. She held up a letter. Old, crumpled. I tried once. Years ago. I sent this to the bishop. Nothing came of it. He called me ungrateful, accused me of hysteria. Why didn't you say something? Because I believed, Madeline. I believed in the church more than I believed in myself. That's the hardest part. She placed the letter on my desk. I can't help you go, she said, but I won't stop you. Quote. She left before I could respond. I stared at the letter, read every word, and felt something shift again. We weren't just running anymore. We were carrying the truth with us, and the world was about to hear it. Some nights carry a silence that isn't peace, but warning. The kind of stillness that comes before a forest fire. That's how the days felt after Mother Margaret left that letter on my desk. Like we were standing at the edge of something huge, and no one knew how long the ground would hold. We didn't speak of it again. She went back to her routines, her rosaries, her quiet walks through the chapel. But I noticed the way she avoided Father Jonas now, how her eyes didn't meet his when he passed in the hall, how her hands trembled ever so slightly during the blessing. She was breaking too only slower, more privately. The rest of us, moved like shadows. We rehearsed the escape in our heads, each of us knowing what to take, what to leave. We couldn't carry much. A few clothes, maybe a loaf of bread, water, documents if we could get them. The plan was set for Friday after evening prayers. Mr. Thomas would wait beyond the back wall, near the oak tree that had grown wild over the years, its branches reaching just far enough to offer cover. He'd bring a ladder of rope he'd hidden in his truck. One by one we'd climb, then vanish into the dark. But the days leading up to it, those were the hardest. Father Jonas grew bolder. Maybe he sensed something shifting, or maybe he'd just stopped pretending. He lingered too long after Mass, found reasons to summon sisters individually. His voice was soft, but sharp underneath, like a blade wrapped in velvet. He called me into the library one afternoon. Said he wanted to ask about the scriptures we were teaching the children for catechism. I didn't refuse. Refusing him was never an option. I walked into that room with my spine straight and my heart roaring. He sat by the window, light filtering through dust and silence. "Sit," he said. I remained standing. "I've noticed changes," he said slowly, folding his hands. "You've become distant, distrustful." "I've become aware," I replied. He smiled, not kindly. "You know, obedience is the foundation of all spiritual life," he said. "Without it, we crumble." "And without truth?" I asked. His eyes flicked toward me, and for a moment I saw it. The cold behind them. The hunger for control, not redemption. He stood, walking slowly to a shelf, pulling down a book without looking at it. "You were so promising," he said. "So devoted. I had such hopes for you." Quote, "I'm not here to fulfill your hopes." He turned. "No," he said softly. "You're here to cause division, chaos, and that is something the church cannot allow." He walked past me then, pausing at the door. "Be careful, sister," he said without turning. "The world is not kind to women who forget their place." He left, and I knew he was preparing something. A warning, a punishment, maybe both. That night, we met in the cellar beneath the kitchen. The one no one used anymore. The air was damp, thick with earth and old wine barrels. Louise, Helen, Claire, and I sat around a single lantern. "He knows," I said. They didn't ask how I knew. They felt it, too. "We can't wait until Friday," Louise said. "We have to go sooner." "Tomorrow night," I said. "After prayers. Rain's coming early. Mr. Thomas can be ready." Helen nodded. "I have the names," she said. "Our birth records, hidden in the chapel drawer." Claire's hands shook as she spoke. "I have money. Small bills. I've been saving them from sewing work for the town." Louise pulled out a wrapped cloth. Bread, dried fruit, bandages. We each had a roll, a piece of this fragile puzzle. But what haunted me most was what we had to leave behind. My rosary. The one my mother gave me when I took my vows. A small wooden cross, worn from years of prayer. I held it that night in the dark, turning it over in my hand like a goodbye. Would God understand what we were doing? I wasn't running from him. I was running toward him, towards something purer than the lies we'd been fed, something braver than the obedience we'd been forced to swallow. The next day was quiet, too quiet. At breakfast, Father Jonas didn't speak, he just watched. After chores, he summoned Mother Margaret to his office. She didn't return for hours. When she did, her face was pale, lips pressed tight. "He knows something," she whispered as we passed in the hall. I tried to mislead him, but, "Be careful." And then the rain began. Heavy, relentless, the kind of rain that made everything else fade away. We used it, let it muffle our steps, hide our fear. After Vespers, we moved. One by one, we gathered in the pantry where the back stair led to the old cellar. I went last, heart thudding like it might give me away. In the cellar, Louise unwrapped the ladder. Helen clutched the documents to her chest. Claire whispered a prayer I couldn't hear. We moved toward the back door, the one that led to the garden and beyond that the wall. Then came the voice. "Going somewhere?" He stood at the top of the stairs. Father Jonas. His face wasn't angry. It was calm, almost amused. "I suspected you'd try something," he said. "But all of you? Together? That's disappointing." None of us moved. "You think you'll be believed?" he asked, stepping down slowly. "Do you think the world outside is any safer for women like you? You'll be laughed at, dismissed, forgotten." Claire backed away. Helen stepped forward, placing herself between him and us. "Stay back," she said. He smiled. "You don't have the authority to command me." "No," she said, "but I have something else." She reached into her pocket and held up a recorder. Small, old, but blinking. His smile dropped. "I've been recording every word you've said since last week," she said. "In confession. In the halls, just in case." Silence. Then he laughed. A low, bitter sound. "It won't matter. They'll protect me. They always do." "Not this time," I said. Louise moved to the door. Claire pulled the bolt. The rain outside was deafening. He didn't follow. Maybe he knew he'd already lost. We ran. Through the kitchen garden, past the fig trees, across the gravel path that led to the wall. There it was, the oak, the ladder. Mr. Thomas stood in the shadows, waiting. He helped us climb one by one into the unknown. When I reached the top, soaked and shaking, I looked back once. The convent stood still. Cold. Drenched in darkness and silence. We disappeared into the rain, into the woods, into the night. We had no home, no names, no certainty. But we had each other. And for the first time in years, we had freedom. The night swallowed us whole. We moved through the trees like shadows, rain stinging our faces, our soaked clothes clinging to us with every step. No one spoke. There was no need. Every breath, every footfall, every rustle of fabric said the same thing. "Keep going. Don't look back." Mr. Thomas led the way, flashlight tucked low in his palm, its beam cutting only a narrow path ahead. Behind him came Claire, still shaking from what nearly happened in the cellar. Louise followed, steady and fierce. Helen stayed close to me. I was last, always glancing behind, not because I thought someone would follow, but because part of me couldn't believe we were really leaving. That our feet were no longer on holy ground, but in the real world again. The trees thinned, and then we saw a small shed, half collapsed, tucked behind an old barn. Mr. Thomas waved us inside. Once the door shut, the rain became a muffled heartbeat, pounding steadily on the roof. There were no candles, just an oil lamp on a crate and a stack of old quilts in the corner. The air smelled of hay and rust, and something faintly sweet apples maybe, long since rotted. Mr. Thomas removed his hat, wiped water from his forehead. "You'll be safe here for the night," he said, voice low. "My brother-in-law doesn't use this place anymore. No one will look here." We huddled near the lamp. Claire curled into herself, her back against the wall. Helen crouched beside her, whispering comfort. Louise sat with her arms folded, watching the door, always watching. I sat down slowly, my knees aching, the adrenaline finally wearing off. The silence pressed heavy, not like the silence of the convent but thicker, almost alive. A silence that held too many questions, none of them ready to be asked. Mr. Thomas crouched beside me. "My cousin lives in Vermont," he said quietly. "She runs a bed and breakfast. Quiet place. Tourists in the summer, not much else. She's agreed to take you in. No questions asked." "Why?" I asked. It wasn't doubt, just disbelief. He looked at me, eyes soft. "My daughter was in a convent once," he said. "She died there. Official story was pneumonia, but she wrote me a letter before it happened, said a priest made her afraid, said no one listened. I didn't act fast enough." He stood then, voice thick. "This is how I make peace with that." We nodded. Not just out of gratitude, but out of recognition. He had lost someone too, the same way we nearly had. He left us with bread, a jug of water, and one promise. "Tomorrow morning, I'll come back with the truck. We leave at dawn." Then he was gone. The rain didn't stop. It fell steady all night, like the sky itself was exhausted but refusing to sleep. I couldn't rest. My body ached. My thoughts wouldn't settle. I kept picturing the look in Father Jonas's eyes, the last time we saw him. Not rage, not even fear. It was calculation. He wouldn't sit still, not after what we'd done. Louise noticed me awake and passed me half a slice of bread. "We'll need new names," she said. "Stories. No one's going to believe the truth if we tell it straight." She was right. We sat together in the dim glow of the lamp and wrote out a plan. Each of us would be a niece, a cousin, a widow. Claire would be my younger sister. Helen, an aunt. Louise, a cousin who'd raised us. We'd lost our family in a fire, started over in Vermont. That would be our story. A simple lie to hide the complicated truth. By the time the lamp burned out, the first light of morning crept under the door. We packed what little we had: blankets, breadcrumbs, papers wrapped in cloth. My journal stayed close, tucked deep inside my coat, pressed against my heart like a second spine. Mr. Thomas returned, true to his word. This time in an old delivery truck with dents along the sides and a faded paint job. He opened the back, helped us climb in among crates and sacks of feed. "No one stops a farmer," he said with a faint smile. He handed me an envelope. Inside was cash, not much, but enough. "For the first week," he said. "My cousin will cover the rest." "I don't know how to thank you," I whispered. "Don't," he said. "Just live. That'll be enough." Then he closed the door, and we were in the dark again. The road was rough, the truck jostling as it climbed through winding hills. We said little, just leaned into each other when the turns got sharp. Helen hummed Once an Old Hymn but stopped halfway through. Her voice cracked. She didn't try again. It took hours, maybe more. Time blurred in that dark metal box. Then the truck slowed. Louise peeked through a slit in the boards. "We're here," she said. The door opened, and sunlight poured in, soft and gold and unfamiliar. We stepped out into a gravel driveway lined with birch trees. A small wooden inn stood ahead, paint peeling but warm-looking, windows open to the breeze. A woman waited at the door, middle-aged, kind eyes, apron dusted with flour. "You must be the Peterson family," she said with a smile that knew better. We nodded. "Come inside," she said. "You're safe now." The days that followed were a strange kind of quiet. We had our own rooms, real beds, warm food. The woman, her name was Margaret too, didn't ask questions. She brought us towels, told us when dinner was, left us alone. Claire barely spoke. She walked the woods behind the inn every morning alone. I worried about her but didn't push. Louise kept to herself, writing lists of things we'd need: jobs, papers, names. Helen began collecting news clippings, anything about Havenwood, anything about the church. I stayed in my room most nights, writing. Not just memories, but everything we had: names, small details that might one day matter. I wrote until my hand ached. Then I'd sleep. Fitfully. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the woods glowed with fire-colored leaves, Margaret knocked on my door. "I thought you might want these," she said, handing me a stack of envelopes. Letters. All from a box Mr. Thomas had sent. The first one was from his cousin, the one who'd lost her daughter. She wrote of her own silence, her guilt, how she hoped we would find a way forward. She said the world needed women like us to speak, even if no one wanted to listen. The second letter was from someone else, a reporter. She'd gotten one of our anonymous notes. She wanted to talk, said she believed something was wrong in Havenwood. She was looking into it. I stared at her name for a long time. Then I tucked the letter away. Not yet. Veverentredi. But the world was beginning to turn, and we weren't just running anymore. We were becoming something else. We didn't know how to live ordinary lives. Not really. In the first weeks at the inn, we moved carefully, like guests in a stranger's home who didn't know where to place their hands. The world outside the convent was louder, faster, full of unfamiliar rhythms, car horns, radios, children laughing in ways we hadn't heard in years. Even the ticking of the old kitchen clock felt jarring at first, like time itself was trying to catch up to us. Margaret, the innkeeper, never asked why we slept with the lights on, or why Helen flinched every time a man's voice came on the television, or why Claire wore 3 layers of clothing even in early spring. She just kept the coffee warm and the door unlocked. We each coped in our own way. Helen cleaned, top to bottom, every corner of the inn, not because it needed it, but because it gave her hands something to do. Something besides tremble. Louise started baking again. Bread mostly. She said the kneading helped her think. By the second week, the scent of rising dough filled the inn most mornings, a smell that made something in all of us unclench, if only for a moment. Claire wandered into the woods, down old trails, sometimes as far as the edge of the nearby town. She never strayed too long, but she never said where she went. We didn't ask. Her silence was its own language, one we were still learning to translate. As for me, I wrote, at night, when the house was still and the only sound was the creak of the porch boards in the wind, I opened my notebook and poured out the parts of the story we hadn't spoken aloud. Not just what happened at the convent, but what it did to us, what it took, what it twisted. I wrote the truth not just to record it, but to hold on to it, because I knew what forgetting felt like. I'd done it before, and I wouldn't do it again. After a month, Margaret told us it was time to move on, not because she was tired of us, but because the town was beginning to notice. Too many women, no visible past, no explanations. People whispered, as they always do. She handed us a phone number. A man named Ellis, she said, ran a garment factory in a city downstate, Cleveland, paid cash, didn't ask questions. It felt like a step we weren't ready for, but we took it anyway. The day we left, Margaret packed us a basket of food and hugged each of us like family. You survived, she said. That's not small. We didn't speak during the drive. The car was borrowed, the road long, and when the skyline of Cleveland appeared in the distance, a haze of gray buildings and blinking lights, I felt something tighten in my chest. Not fear. Not exactly. It was the weight of starting over. Ellis turned out to be a man in his 60s with tired eyes and a voice like gravel. He barely glanced at our paperwork. You say you're cousins, he said. Yes. Louise replied without hesitation. And one aunt. He nodded once, as if that was enough. You can start Monday. We rented a small house near the edge of the city. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, thin walls and old plumbing. But it was ours. We bought second-hand furniture, learned how to ride the bus, shopped for groceries without habits or veils. It all felt strange at first, being addressed by strangers, being seen as ordinary women, being looked at. I remember the first time someone called me Miss. It nearly made me cry. Work was hard. The factory floor buzzed with machines and sweat. The air smelled of oil and cloth and something metallic that never fully left your nose. We stitched uniforms, 8 hours a day, hands raw by the end of each shift. But it paid. It fed us. And it made us feel just a little like we belonged somewhere again. We chose new names. Simple ones. Names we could pronounce easily when asked. I became Lena. Helen chose Ruth. Louise picked Carol. Claire went by Marie. Names that meant nothing to anyone but us. Evenings were quiet. We cooked together, sat in the living room listening to the radio. Sometimes, when the news came on, we'd hold our breath, waiting for the word Havenwood. But it never came. He hadn't come after us. Not yet. Still, we stayed alert. Always alert. We didn't go to church. None of us could step through those doors. Not then. Maybe not ever. We prayed, but not the way we used to. No memorized chants or rosaries, just whispers at night. Or a hand held a little longer. Or a glance that said, I'm still here. The second month, Helen fell ill. Just a fever, the doctor said. Nothing serious. But when the nurse asked for her last name, Helen froze. I stepped in. Ruth Peterson, I said. The nurse nodded. Date of birth? Helen looked at me. I gave. Afterward, she stared out the window for a long time. It's not just names we lost, she said. It's the right to be known. We didn't answer. There wasn't one. Later that week, a man from the factory offered me a ride home. He was kind, middle-aged, polite. I declined. He asked again the next day. That night, I couldn't sleep. The memory of hands that didn't ask permission, of words wrapped in scripture, of trust used like a niphenone of it had left me. And it still lived under my skin. I realized then we hadn't escaped everything. Only the walls. Not the fear. Not yet. The next Sunday we walked to the lake. All 4 of us. The path was quiet, lined with brittle trees and soft wind. We didn't talk much. Just watched the water shift in the sunlight. Claire broke the silence first. I dream of him, she said. We didn't have to ask who. Sometimes he's in the kitchen. Sometimes he's in my room. Sometimes he just stands in the doorway and stares. Helen nodded. I dream of the chapel. Empty. Cold. Louise looked at her hands. I hear his voice when I sew. He didn't speak. I couldn't. We stood there, the wind wrapping around us like a question. Then Helen said something I'll never forget. I think we have to tell. One day. Not now. But someday, quote. Louise turned to her. Why? What good would it do? Helen looked out at the lake. Because the truth has weight. And we've been carrying it alone. We stood in silence for a long time after that. And I knew deep down we hadn't just fled. We were waiting. Waiting for the world to be ready for what we had to say. Or for us to be brave enough to say it anyway. Winter came like an old story we had heard too many times. The kind that starts soft, with a breeze, and ends in silence so thick you forget what warmth felt like. Snow piled at the windows. The factory slowed. Days grew shorter. Nights stretched like shadows across the floor. We'd been in Cleveland nearly a year. And still, none of us dared say our real names aloud. On the surface, we were stable. Rent was paid. The house stayed warm. Work came and went with clockwork precision. But under all of that, under the chores, the meals, the Sunday walks, there was a tightness. A breath we hadn't exhaled. A truth that hadn't yet been released. One Tuesday evening, after dinner, Helen brought out a small wooden box. She had kept it hidden under her bed, wrapped in an old scarf, the kind with tiny hand-stitched crosses along the edge. She placed it in the center of the table. We all stopped what we were doing. Inside were notes, clippings, pieces of paper that looked like they had been handled 1,000 times. There was a photograph, too, black and white, slightly blurred. It was him, Father Jonas, standing at the front steps of a different church, shaking hands with someone in a dark suit. The headline read, "Local Parish Honors Clergy for Years of Service." We stared at the image like it might burn us. Helen's hands shook as she unfolded another clipping. "He's being promoted," she said. "Bishop's assistant, regional authority, more influence, more access." No one spoke for a while. Then Louise pushed her chair back and stood. "We have to do something." Claire looked up, startled. "Like what?" "Speak," Louise said. "Tell someone. Anyone. This can't go on." Helen lowered her gaze. "We're not ready." "Then when?" Louise asked. "When we're too old? When he's done it to more girls?" I watched them both, their pain so loud I could almost feel it in my skin. "We need more than words," I said quietly. Helen looked at me. "We need proof." That night, I sat at the kitchen table alone, the old lamp flickering against the frost-covered window. I pulled out my journal. Pages worn, corners curled. I flipped back to the beginning, the entries from the convent, the hidden notes, the days I thought I might lose myself to the weight of pretending. I copied everything. Onto new pages, clean pages. Just in case. It wasn't bravery. It was preparation. And still, every sound outside made me jump. A knock at the door. A voice too close to the window. That sense we'd never fully left the convent behind. 2 weeks later, something happened that shifted everything. It was Saturday morning. I had gone to the corner market to pick up bread and tea. Claire stayed behind to clean. Louise was working an extra shift. Helen was in bed with a cold. I was halfway home when I saw the flyer, tacked to a telephone pole, wet from the snow. It was for a church event, a conference for clergy, a panel discussion, and listed among the speakers' name, Father Jonas Bell. Now, Monsignor. Topic: the role of faith in modern society. My legs nearly gave out beneath me. I stood there for what felt like hours, the snow falling, cars passing, my breath fogging the air. Then I tore the flyer down and stuffed it into my coat. At home, I laid it on the table. Claire read it first. "He's still out there," she whispered. "No," Helen said, eyes sharp. "He's not just out there. He's being celebrated." Louise walked in not long after. One glance at the flyer and her jaw clenched tight. This ends now. It was Louise who made the first call. To the number on one of the old letters Helen had saved. A reporter, a woman named Sarah Price, based in Columbus, specialized in stories the church didn't want told. She called back within an hour. We took turns speaking with her. Louise told her about the first time she noticed things weren't right. Claire talked about the night in the sacristy. Helen described the pressure, the isolation, the manipulation. And two told her about the journal, the records, the letters, the threats. There was a long pause on the other end. Then she said, "I believe you." 3 words. Soft, but they hit like thunder. She wanted to meet us. In person. She promised discretion. No names printed without consent. No movement without our approval. We agreed. The meeting was set for the following Friday. Neutral ground. A cafe on the outskirts of town. The night before, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the gate behind the convent, the way the ivy had grown over the cracks, how it felt, climbing over it, into the unknown. This felt the same. I opened the journal one more time, ran my fingers over the ink, remembered the girl I had been when I wrote it. The one who had once believed silence was safety. That girl was gone, replaced by a woman who was still afraid but willing to speak anyway. Friday came cold and gray. We dressed in plain coats, tied our scarves tight. The cafe was quiet, half full with couples and old men reading papers. Sarah Price sat in the back, notebook in hand, eyes alert. She stood when we approached. "Thank you for coming," she said. We sat and began again, telling the story. This time, to someone who was writing it down. She listened, for hours, asked questions, took notes. She never interrupted. Never doubted. Never looked away. At the end, she closed her notebook and said, "You've been silenced long enough." We left the cafe in silence. No one said it out loud, but we all felt it. The tide was turning. And for the first time in years, we weren't drowning alone. The wind had a different sound that morning. It wasn't louder, not exactly, but sharper, as if the world had taken a breath and was holding it, waiting for what came next. The cafe had emptied hours earlier. The chairs were stacked, the windows fogged from the inside. But we lingered on the sidewalk after the meeting, our hands buried deep in our coat pockets, our faces turned toward a sky so gray it looked heavy enough to fall. None of us said what we were thinking. We didn't have to. We'd spoken to someone. A stranger, yes, but one who believed us. That belief, simple as it was, had shifted something inside. The silence we had worn like armor had cracked, just a little, and through it came light and fear. When we got home, we closed every curtain. Helen turned off the radio. Claire locked the back door twice. It was Louise who broke the silence. "What happens now?" No one answered right away. I opened my notebook, stared at the last page. Sarah had taken a copy of everything, promised to handle it with care. But letting it go, letting someone else carry part of that truth, it felt like peeling off skin. "Now," I said finally, "we wait." The days that followed were uneasy. Nothing happened. No phone calls, no headlines, just the same routine. Wake. Work. Cook. Sleep. But it didn't feel the same anymore. Every knock on the door made us jump. Every stranger's glance on the bus carried a weight we hadn't felt before. We'd unleashed something, and we didn't know if it would protect us or bury us. Then, a week later, a letter arrived. Plain envelope. No return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping. Small. Easy to miss. But there it was. A headline tucked into the corner of the local section. Allegations emerge against Monsignor Bell in early years of ministry. The article was cautious. Phrases like unverified accounts and sources familiar with the matter floated between the lines. But the bones were there. An anonymous report, a former nun, claims of abuse and coercion. He denied everything. Of course he did. Called the accusations deeply hurtful and baseless. The article ended with a single sentence. "The diocese has declined to comment at this time." Claire sat with the paper in her lap, eyes glazed. "They printed it," she whispered. They actually printed it. Helen poured tea without speaking. Louise folded the paper slowly, placed it in the center of the table. "We need to be ready," she said. "For what?" Claire asked. "For him to fight back." Gray. And he did. The very next day, Helen received a letter. No signature. No return address. Just a single page. "I know who you are. I know where you are. You should have stayed silent." She didn't tell us right away. I found her that night sitting on the bathroom floor, knees pulled to her chest, the letter torn in pieces beside her. "I didn't want to worry you," she said, voice small. I sat beside her, my heart a drum in my throat. "We were always going to be found," I said. "The truth never stays buried. But what if it takes us with it?" I didn't have an answer. That night, we stayed in the same room, all four of us. Like we had in the convent, when the thunder rolled through and we whispered prayers under our breath. But now, our prayers were not for courage. They were for justice, and for each other. Sarah called the next morning. "I've received 3 more testimonies," she said. "Other women, one from another convent, one from a nearby parish. They heard about the article. They're ready to speak." My knees went weak. Helen clutched the receiver, her face pale. "Do they know it's us?" "Not yet," Sarah said. "I've kept you anonymous. But we may need to go public if this goes further. People want faces, names, not just stories." We told her we'd call her back. Claire was the first to speak after we hung up. "I can't," she said. "I want to, but I can't." "No one's asking you to," Louise said gently. "I'll do it," Helen said suddenly, with my name. We all turned. She looked down, then back up. "I stayed quiet too long. It doesn't matter what they say about me. Let them call me unstable. Let them say I imagined it. I know what he did. I remember." Silence settled over the room, thick and reverent. Then Louise nodded. "I'll stand beside you." That night, I opened the notebook again. I wrote a new page. Not about the past, but about now. The decision to speak, the choice to risk it all. I signed my real name at the bottom. Madeleine Carter. The name I hadn't written in almost 10 years. The next day, we met Sarah again. This time, she brought a photographer. We stood against a brick wall outside the cafe, the wind biting, our coats buttoned high. Later that week, the article went live. "The Women Behind the Silence. Former nuns speak out against clerical abuse." Our faces were there, our names, our truth. And the storm came fast. Emails, calls, letters, some kind, some cruel, some from strangers who had lived the same thing and never told a soul until now. One woman wrote, "I thought I was the only one." Another, "Thank you for saying it out loud." But not all were supportive. The church released a statement denying everything, calling it a smear campaign. They accused us of bitterness, of exaggeration, of trying to destroy a man's reputation built over decades. They called us liars. We weren't surprised, but it still hurt. And then, a new voice entered the story. A young priest, Father Daniel Green. He wrote an open letter, published in a religious journal. "I believe them," it said, "because I've seen what happens when power goes unchecked, because faith without accountability is just a mask, and because the church cannot be a house of healing if it refuses to face its sickness." It was a spark. On we hadn't expected. More priests spoke. Quietly. At first. Then louder. And people began to ask questions. Not just about Father Jonas, but about the system that sheltered him, the silence he thrived in, and what it had cost. Us. Others. The church itself. We weren't safe yet. But we weren't invisible either. For the first time in years, I looked at the sky and didn't feel the need to hide from it. Cleveland felt different after the article. The same streets, same storefronts, same buses whining through intersections, but something had shifted. We weren't hiding anymore. And even though that didn't mean we were safe, it meant we were visible. That, in its own fragile way, was a kind of freedom. Of course, not everyone welcomed the truth. Some neighbors stopped speaking to us. A woman at the laundromat stared too long, then left her basket behind. One man, a factory supervisor, walked past Louise like she wasn't there, even though they'd shared morning coffee for 6 months. Helen said it didn't bother her, but I saw how she lingered in doorways now, how she flinched when a stranger knocked, and how, at night, her prayers grew quieter, not weaker, but more private, as if she were speaking to someone who needed convincing. The factory called a meeting 3 days after the article ran. We sat in folding chairs, fingers curled around the edges, waiting for someone to say we were being let go. Instead, Mr. Ellis cleared his throat and said, "You've always done your jobs. That's what matters here." Then he walked out, and no one else said a word. We exhaled. A little. But something in me knew this wasn't the end of the storm. It was only the eye, and something else was coming. Claire didn't return to work. She said it was the crowds, the noise, the staring. Mostly, though, it was the memories. They came harder now, waking her at night, rising like smoke through her dreams. She'd sit at the kitchen table with a glass of water, staring into nothing, her knuckles white against the glass. "I'm trying," she said one morning, voice thin. "But it feels like the walls are still here, just made of different things." I didn't have an answer for that, because I felt them too. Even after telling the truth, after putting our names to the pain, the weight didn't disappear. It only changed shape. Now it was shaped like expectation, like doubt, like waiting for someone to tell us we were wrong, or worse, that it didn't matter. Sarah Price called again. Her voice was urgent this time. "He's retained lawyers," she said, "and they've filed a defamation claim." Of course he had. We expected it, but hearing the words still hit like a slap. Helen sat down, steadying herself with the arm of the couch. "They're going to try to bury us again," she said. Sarah assured us the case was weak, that we had evidence, witnesses, years of documented behavior. "But it's going to get public," she warned. "His lawyers want to discredit you. They'll dig." We understood. They would twist our silence into guilt, our running into cowardice, our trauma into fiction. They always did. We gathered in the living room that night, the four of us, sitting close, our knees touching, the heat from the radiator humming quietly behind us. "I won't take it back," Louise said. "Not one word." "No one's asking you to," I said. Claire looked up. "If they come for us, I'm scared I'll disappear again, into myself, like I did back then." I reached over, took her hand. "You didn't disappear," I said. "You survived, and now you're here. That's everything." We made a pact that night. No matter what came next, we would not undo the truth. Not for safety, not for comfort, not even for peace. We would hold the line, together. The following week, Sarah arranged an interview. A televised segment, short and simple. She wanted one of us on camera, face blurred, voice altered, if we preferred, but she said it would matter. People listened more when they saw a face. Hele volunteered. She wore a gray sweater, one we'd found at the thrift store, and spoke into the microphone with a calm I hadn't seen in years. "I was taught obedience," she said. "And for a long time I thought that meant silence. But obedience to truth is louder than obedience to fear." The footage aired on a Tuesday night. By Wednesday morning we had a stack of letters at the door. Some were angry, some were cruel, but many weren't. One was from a woman in her 80s who said, "I left the church 60 years ago. Thank you for reminding me why I did." Another from a young teacher. "I play your words in my classroom when I teach about courage." We read them slowly, passing them hand to hand, as if they were too sacred to rush. Then came the envelope with no return address. Inside, a single line, typed in plain font. "Truth always leaks through the cracks, sister." No name. But we knew it wasn't a threat. It was solidarity. Claire taped it to the fridge. Then, 3 days later, Sarah called again. "There's someone who wants to meet you," she said. "Who?" "A priest," she answered. "Young. His name's Father John Carver. He's been following the case, quietly. He asked if he could speak with you off the record." "Vi hesitated." "Another priest?" But Sarah said, "I think he's different." So we agreed. He came to our house, no collar, just a jacket and a notebook tucked under his arm. His eyes. He didn't introduce himself like a priest. There was no performance in his presence, no long pauses or heavy language meant to impress. Just a man in his early 30s, shoulders hunched slightly as if he wasn't sure he belonged in the room. And maybe that's what made us let him in. We cleared space at the kitchen table, the same one where we had first unwrapped the truth. Claire poured coffee with hands that no longer trembled. Louise placed a small bowl of bread in the center, almost instinctively. Helen sat straight, chin lifted. I waited. He looked at each of us before speaking. "My name is John Carver," he said quietly. "I serve at St. Augustine's Parish 2 towns over. I read the articles, I watched the interviews, and I wanted to thank you, not as a priest, just as a person." We watched him, unsure. "I've worked with young people," he continued. "Seminarians, mostly. Some come in broken, ashamed of feelings they don't know how to name. And I've seen how silence turns into shame, and shame into complicity. I've questioned the system for a long time, but I never spoke." Helen leaned forward. "And now?" He looked down at his hands, then back up. "Now I want to help." There was a long pause. It was Louise who broke it. "Why us?" "Because you said it out loud," he answered. Because you made room for others to speak, I think I can make that room bigger. Quote. He pulled a thin folder from his coat and placed it on the table. No flourish. Just fact. I've been gathering internal documents, he said. Letters, memos, complaints that never saw daylight. Helen opened it slowly. Inside, pages of correspondence. Some names we knew, some we didn't, some dated decades ago. They knew, I said quietly. Even then. He nodded. I can't change the past, but I can help build the case now, the canonical one. Claire cleared her throat, voice unsteady. What does that mean? A formal process through church law, he explained. It's not fast, and it's not always fair, but it can strip a priest of his title, his power. It can leave a mark that history won't erase. Louise looked him dead in the eye. And if they bury it again? Then I'll help you take it outside the church, he said without hesitation. It was the first time someone in a collar had promised us more than prayers. Helen folded the folder closed. We'll think about it. Quote. He nodded, respectful. When he left, he didn't ask for anything in return. No photos, no quotes. Just a handshake and a whispered thank you before disappearing into the evening light. After the door shut, we sat in silence for a while. Claire touched the edge of the folder, then pulled her hand back. I want to believe he means it, she said. I think he does, I replied. But meaning well, Louise added, has never been enough. She was right. Still, we gave him the benefit of a single step. 2 days later, we met him again. This time at his parish, a modest brick church with peeling paint and a crooked sign out front. It didn't feel grand. It felt human. He led us through a side door into a small office where books were stacked in uneven towers and a kettle steamed quietly on a hot plate. I invited someone else, he said. If that's all right. The woman who entered wore a charcoal suit and carried a leather satchel. No collar. No cross. Maria Torres, she introduced herself. I'm an investigator appointed by the diocese. Independent. At least, that's the promise. Helen raised an eyebrow. And how many of these promises get kept? Maria didn't blink. Fewer than I'd like, but I still try. She opened her bag and pulled out a recorder. I want to hear your stories in your own words. Not transcripts, not articles. Just you, talking, however you want. We didn't say yes right away. We asked questions. About her past. About what would happen next. About who would hear the recordings and whether they would be twisted, like everything else had been. She didn't sugarcoat it. It will be hard, she said. There are still people who'd rather you stayed invisible. But I believe the truth is stronger than that. And so far, no one's been willing to say it like you have. We looked at one another. Then I nodded. We'll do it. Quote. Over the next 3 weeks, we told our stories again. Not for the newspapers. Not for the public, but for the record, the one that mattered. We sat in that little office and took turns, sometimes just one of us, sometimes 2, sometimes all 4. We cried. We paused. We corrected each other gently, and as the recorder hummed quietly on the table, we rewrote history the way it should have been written from the start. Maria never interrupted. She never pushed. She just listened, and slowly, the silence that had once held us hostage turned into something else. Evidence. When the last tape clicked off, she packed up her bag and stood. I can't promise the church will do what's right, she said, but I can promise they won't be able to pretend they didn't know anymore. It was more than anyone else had ever offered. That evening, Claire did something she hadn't done since the convent. She played the piano. We'd found it second-hand months ago, tucked in the corner of the living room, out of tune and half forgotten. But she sat down as if no time had passed. Her fingers moved slowly at first, then with purpose. A hymn. One we used to hum during chores. Only now, it didn't sound like ritual. It sounded like memory, reclaimed. Helen sat beside her, singing softly. Louise and I stood in the doorway, watching, hearts full and sore. The world outside hadn't changed much. Father Jonas was still walking free. The church still hadn't made a formal statement. But inside that small house, with music in the air and light in the windows, we felt something different. Not justice. Not yet. But direction. A steady walk forward. We didn't know what would come next. But for the first time, we didn't feel alone walking toward it. Winter loosened its grip slowly that year, like it wasn't ready to let go. The snow stayed longer than usual, clinging to gutters, melting only in patches along the sidewalks. But inside our house, something had begun to thaw. Claire played the piano nearly every evening now. Her songs were soft and searching, the kind that didn't need words to carry meaning. Helen joined her sometimes, her voice low, not always steady, but filled with something deeper than melody. Louise baked more. Cinnamon rolls, lemon cakes, as if sweetness could remind us that we were still allowed to feel joy. I kept writing, not just about the past, but about the after, about what survival looked like when it no longer meant hiding. The days blurred together, not in fear but in purpose. And then came the letter. It arrived on a Thursday, hand-delivered, stamped with the seal of the diocese. Helen found it in the mailbox and brought it inside without a word. We gathered around the table as she opened it, fingers firm but slow, like peeling back a memory we hadn't asked to relive. It was official. The church was opening a formal canonical investigation into Monsignor Bell. A process, structured, verified, bound by rules most people didn't understand and fewer trusted, but it was real. At the bottom, 3 names were listed. The board. A panel of clergy and laypeople selected to oversee the case. And one more name, scribbled in ink at the end, Father John Carver. Claire touched the page as if it might vanish. Helen sat down slowly. I didn't think they'd do it, she whispered. Louise didn't look up. They didn't do it for us, she said. They did it because they were forced to. I wanted to argue, to say it mattered anyway, but I couldn't find the words, because she was right. Still, that night, I slept without waking. Not because justice was guaranteed, but because silence had finally been broken at the highest table. Weeks passed, filled with interviews and statements and paperwork so dense it seemed to smother the very truth it was meant to carry. But we did it. Every page, every memory, every detail that once felt too raw to speak aloud now sat in boxes and folders, labeled, catalogued, official. Sarah Price called one evening, her voice more excited than usual. Other dioceses are asking questions, she said. Other victims are reaching out. This is bigger than any of us thought. We sat in the living room that night, listening to her words echo in the quiet. Claire whispered, I think this might actually change something. But Louise, ever grounded, replied, let's wait and see. Then came the summons. Monsignor Bell had been called to testify. We weren't invited. Not yet, but we were informed. And something about knowing he would have to answer even, if only behind closed doors, felt like a small tide turning in a vast ocean. Still, fear lingered. Every phone call, every knock, every unfamiliar car outside the house stirred the old panic. One afternoon, as I walked back from the post office, a man in a gray coat stepped from a parked sedan and blocked my path. You're Sister Madeline, aren't you? The sound of that name in his mouth made my blood go cold. I don't use that name anymore, I said. He smiled, thinly. I'm here on behalf of the Monsignor's legal counsel. We'd appreciate it if you refrained from making further public statements, for your own good. I stared at him. Is that a threat? No, he said. It's a suggestion. Sometimes the past is best left where it belongs. I stepped closer. And sometimes the past grows teeth when it's ignored. He didn't reply, just turned and walked away. When I told the others, no one was surprised. Not even Claire. They're nervous, Louise said. That means we're doing something right. Helen stood at the window, arms crossed. We're not going back, she said, no matter what they try. And we didn't. Instead, we prepared. Father John visited often now, not in robes, not as a priest, but as a man trying to use the weight of his position to balance the scales, even slightly. He brought updates when he could, quiet encouragement when he couldn't. The process is moving, he said one evening, slowly, but forward. We offered him tea. He always accepted. One evening he brought someone else, an older woman, tall and quiet, with hair pulled back in a braid and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. This is Evelyn, he said. She was the housekeeper at Havenwood for almost 20 years. She reached out after reading the article. Evelyn sat with her hands folded neatly on her lap. I saw more than I should have, she said, and I said nothing. Her voice didn't shake, but her eyes shimmered. I thought I was protecting the church, but really, I was protecting a man. She opened her purse and pulled out a letter, Faded, folded, creased so many times it barely held together. "I wrote this in 1981, she said. "To the diocese. Never sent it. I was afraid." Louise took it gently, read the first few lines aloud. "There is something wrong here. I don't know how to name it, but it isn't holy." We passed it from hand to hand, like a sacred relic. Evelyn stayed for hours, telling her story in pieces. Not just what she witnessed, but what she carried. The weight of silence. The years of knowing she hadn't stopped it. When she left, she hugged Helen and said, "I'm sorry, I should have been braver." Helen held her tight. "You are now." That night, I returned to my journal and turned to a blank page. At the top I wrote, "What courage looks like when it arrives late," and underneath, "It still counts." In the weeks that followed, more people came forward. Former novices, parishioners, even a retired bishop who said, "I looked away, I won't anymore." And slowly, the story stopped being just ours. It belonged to all of us now, those who spoke, those who couldn't, those still waiting for the words. Then, one morning, an envelope arrived with the seal of the Holy See. No introduction, just a verdict. Monsignor Bell, suspended indefinitely, removed from public ministry, referred for further disciplinary action under canon law. He wouldn't wear the collar again. He wouldn't stand at the pulpit. He wouldn't bless another child. It wasn't jail. It wasn't full justice. But it was a fall, and the sound of it echoed all the way back to Havenwood. You would think that justice, when it finally arrives, would feel louder, that it would come like thunder sharp, undeniable, and somehow enough. But the truth is, it doesn't. Not always. Sometimes it arrives folded in a plain envelope, slipped through a mail slot while the kettle boils and a radio hums softly in the background. That morning, I was the one who picked up the letter. The seal was real. I held it in my hands, thumb tracing its edge, not because I doubted what was inside, but because I wasn't sure what it would mean once I opened it. We had been carrying the weight so long, it had started to feel like part of us. I brought it into the kitchen. Helen looked up first, then Louise. Claire stopped drying the dishes mid-motion, the towel still clutched in her hand. We didn't sit. We didn't breathe. I opened it. The words were clear. Final. Monsignor Bell would never again serve in a public role within the church. No more sacraments. No more sermons. No more authority. They stripped him of the titles he once wore like armor. And though it didn't speak of prison or criminal trials, it carried weight. It was not enough. But it was real. Claire let out a sound, something between a gasp and a prayer. Helen closed her eyes. Louise looked out the window and whispered, "It's done." But it wasn't. Not really. Because justice on paper doesn't undo the years. It doesn't rewrite the silence. It doesn't erase the dreams that still wake you up drenched in sweat, or the way you scan a crowd without meaning to, searching for a face you pray you'll never see again. Still, that evening we lit a candle. No ceremony. No speeches. Just a quiet flame flickering between us at the kitchen table, surrounded by the ordinary teacups, crumbs from a dinner we barely tasted, the slow tick of the wall clock. I thought of Anna, of Martha, of the others who couldn't stand beside us now. We'd made it to this point with their names in our pockets, their voices folded between the pages of journals and affidavits, and memories no tribunal would ever fully grasp. "I wonder where he is now," Claire said. "In some rectory somewhere," Louise replied. "Or maybe a retirement home." Helen didn't speak. Her face was unreadable. The way it got when her thoughts traveled too far to be pulled back quickly. Later, I walked out to the porch alone. The air was colder than expected for spring. I wrapped my shawl tighter, looked up at the stars that had started to pierce the dark sky. I thought about how long we had waited for this moment, how different it felt from what I'd imagined in the early days back, when my hands still shook at the sound of his name. I didn't feel victorious, but I did feel steady. The next few days were quiet. Sarah Price published her final piece on the story. It was longer than any of the others. She called it What Faith Forgot. She didn't just write about the abuse. She wrote about the way systems protect power, about how easy it is to mistake obedience for holiness, and about how we, 4 women who had once taken vows of silence, had reclaimed something that had been stolen. We read it together, in the living room, passing the newspaper hand to hand like it was sacred. When it reached Claire, She folded it and pressed it to her chest. "I feel seen," she said. And that was enough for that day. Not long after, Evelyn came to visit again. She brought a box. Inside were old photographs, handwritten notes, things she'd collected from her time at Havenwood. Most of them meant little on their own. A blurry picture of a choir, a list of chores, a note that read, "Father will be staying overnight. Prepare the guest room." But when pieced together, they told a story. Not of evil, exactly, but of 1,000 small permissions. A culture of deference that allowed darkness to grow unnoticed or worse, ignored. "This is yours," Evelyn said. "I think you'll know what to do with it." We didn't answer right away, but we knew what she meant. We had been given a story, and stories, when left untold, don't rest. Helen reached out and touched the side of the box. "Maybe it's time we wrote the ending ourselves." That evening, I opened a new journal. Not to record what had happened, but to begin shaping what could come next. I called it The After. And on the first page I wrote, "We left to save ourselves. We spoke to save others. Now we live to prove it was not in vain." Claire began teaching piano lessons at the community center, just 2 afternoons a week, but the room filled quickly. Parents smiled, children laughed, and the sound of music drifted down the hallway like a hymn we had never learned in chapel. Louise joined a local women's shelter as a volunteer. Quiet work, cooking, cleaning, listening. She never shared her story unless asked, but sometimes, just sitting beside someone else's pain was enough. Helen started attending open mic nights at a small bookstore 2 blocks from the house. She didn't read her own writing, not at first, but she clapped loudest. And once, she recited a poem that ended with the line, "I am not what they tried to make of me." I started writing letters. Not for publication, just responses to the ones we'd received. To the woman in Kansas who left the church but never stopped praying. To the daughter who found her mother's journal after her death and finally understood the silence that once divided them. To the girl who said, "I've never been hurt, but I needed to know that people like you exist." Each letter was a thread, each reply a stitch. Slowly, we began to mend something bigger than ourselves. Then, one morning, a package arrived. New return address. New note. Inside was a small book. Leather-bound, familiar. I recognized it immediately. It was mine. The first journal, the one I thought I'd lost when we fled, the one I believed had vanished in the chaos of our escape. I opened it with trembling fingers. Every page was intact. My handwriting. My voice, young and scared and determined. Somehow, it had made its way home. On the inside cover, a new message had been added, written in a different hand. "Truth has a way of finding its way back." I stared at that line for a long time, and something inside me settled. Not completely, not cleanly, but enough to keep going. Spring arrived in quiet degrees. Not all at once, but in just Teresa's softness in the wind, the way the sunlight stretched just a little longer across the porch, the return of birds that sounded unfamiliar after so many months of winter hush. The streets stayed gray, the world still messy, still uncertain, but something had shifted in our home. You could feel it in the way we moved, in how the weight we carried no longer dragged quite as low. Claire hung curtains in the kitchen. Yellow ones. Helen planted herbs in mismatched pots along the windowsill. Louise ordered a second-hand bookshelf online and filled it with paperbacks from thrift stores and old hymnals no one had touched in years. And I kept writing. The journal that had returned to me, mysteriously and without explanation, sat open on my desk. I still didn't know who had sent it. The handwriting on the inside cover didn't belong to anyone I recognized, but it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a gesture, someone out there acknowledging our truth and choosing to return part of it home. Most mornings I'd read a page or two before beginning my day. Some entries made me flinch, others brought a strange comfort, but all of them reminded me that my voice had always been there, even when no one had listened. Even when I thought it didn't matter. Then, one afternoon, Sarah Price called again. Her tone was different. "Madeline," she said, "you should sit down." I did. She continued, slow and steady. "Monsignor Bell died this morning, in his sleep, at a care facility in Florida. Complications from a stroke. The church issued a short statement. Nothing detailed. Just, final. Great." The line went silent for a moment. I heard the faint sound of traffic on her end. And then she added, "I thought you should know before it's in the papers." I thanked her, hung up, and sat there, staring at nothing. It wasn't shock. It wasn't grief. It was something else. An ending without closure. A chapter closed without resolution. I told the others at dinner. No build-up, just the truth. Claire set down her fork and folded her hands in her lap. Helen's jaw tightened. She didn't speak for a long time. Louise leaned back in her chair and sighed. "Did he suffer?" she asked, not to any of us in particular. "I don't know," I said. "Does it matter?" Helen said, eyes fixed on her water glass. No one answered. The next morning, we didn't mention it. Not once. Not over breakfast, or during the walk to the market, or in the quiet hours afterward. It hovered, unspoken but not ignored, like dust in a room you've already swept once but know will settle again. But that night, something strange happened. I dreamed of Havenwood. Not the terror, not the cold hallways or the shadowed corners. I dreamed of the garden. It was spring there, too vivid and full. The lavender had bloomed early, bees drifted low through the air, and in the distance, I could hear someone humming, a familiar tune, something we used to sing while shelling peas or tying bundles of thyme. I followed the sound. It was Martha. She sat at the base of the statue near the chapel, hands in her lap, her eyes lifted to the sky. She looked the way I remembered her, strong, weathered, steady. When she saw me, she didn't smile. She just nodded, like she'd been waiting. I woke with tears already on my face. The next morning, I walked to the little park at the end of our street. I sat on a bench near the fountain, the notebook in my lap, a pen in my hand, and I wrote, not about him, but about her, and Anna, and Eleanor, and Joy, and all the others who had left pieces of themselves behind in that convent, who had vanished from records and memory, made footnotes in someone else's story. I wrote their names one by one. I wrote what I remembered: the sound of Anna's laugh before it was taken, the way Eleanor quoted scripture like it was stitched into her skin, how Joy sang with her whole chest, off-key but always full of light. I wrote it all down. For them. For us. And then I went home. When I walked in, Helen was in the living room, holding the mail. She handed me a small envelope, beige and plain, no return address. Inside was a photograph. It was old. Faded. 5 women in habits, standing in front of the chapel steps. It took me a moment. Then I saw it myself, barely 17. Next to Claire. Martha behind us. Joy laughing mid-turn. Anna, blinking at the sun. I hadn't seen that image in decades. On the back, one line, written in pencil. "You were never invisible." I handed it to Helen without a word. She read it, then handed it to Louise. Claire looked at it last and held it longest. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Later that night, we laid the photo in the center of the table, next to the candle we'd once lit for justice. The wax had melted down long ago, leaving only a glass shell. Claire lit a new one. No prayers this time, just presence. The wind tapped against the windows as if asking to be let in. Helen placed her hand over the photo. "I used to think surviving was enough," she said. "But now I think being remembered is just as sacred." Louise nodded. "And remembering," Claire whispered, "and refusing to forget." That night, I returned to the garden in my dreams. This time, I was not alone. We were all there. In different corners, doing what we had always done. Martha baking bread in the open-air oven. Joy chasing a squirrel with a broom. Eleanor reading by the chapel steps. Anna writing letters no one would read. And me watching, until I felt someone beside me. It was myself, not the woman I was, but the girl I had been. She looked up at me and said, not with words but with eyes, "You did it. You carried us." I woke just before sunrise. The light was pale, barely reaching the window. But I knew. Some endings don't come in thunder. They arrive quiet, wrapped in wind and ash and memory. And sometimes, that's enough. Time has a strange way of folding itself around pain. It doesn't erase it, or even soften the edges much. But after a while, it becomes something you can carry without flinching. Something you learn to walk beside, instead of dragging behind you. A month passed since the news of his death. Life didn't change overnight. There were no grand announcements, no ringing bells or open apologies. The church released a final statement measured, vague, full of phrases like regret and lessons learned. His name would not be honored, but neither would it be condemned. We expected that. By then, we had learned that justice and truth don't always walk hand in hand. Sometimes, they pass each other in the street without ever meeting eyes. Still, there were things worth holding on to. Sarah Price's articles had been compiled into a book. She called it A Choir of Silence. She sent us an early copy with a handwritten note tucked between the pages. "This is yours as much as mine." We kept the book on the coffee table, dog-eared, and read often. Visitors would glance at it, sometimes pick it up. A few would recognize the names. Most wouldn't. But that was all right. We weren't telling the story for attention. We were telling it so that it lived outside of us. Claire had started a small music group for children at the community center. Twice a week, she gathered them in a sunlit room and taught them rhythm with wooden spoons and overturned buckets. They adored her. One boy, no older than 6, called her Sister Sunshine. She didn't correct him. Helen began mentoring young women at the local shelter. She didn't tell them everything, but she told enough. Enough for them to know she had been through something. Enough for them to trust her when she said, "You can come back from it." Louise became something of a fixture at the food pantry downtown. She was quiet, consistent, and never forgot a face. People brought her recipes, asked for her advice, and sometimes just sat beside her in silence. She made them feel safe, even if they didn't know why. And I returned to Havenwood. Not out of anger, not even out of closure, just to see. I didn't tell the others at first. I rented a car, drove alone, a route I hadn't taken in more than 2 decades. The highway felt longer than I remembered, the trees taller. Or maybe it was just me who had changed shape. The town was smaller than memory suggested. The diner on the corner was still there, though the sign was cracked and sun-faded. The library looked exactly the same, right down to the chipped paint on the front step. The air carried that same blend of pine and damp earth that had once been the scent of everything I believed in. I parked across from the old convent. It wasn't a convent anymore. A faded banner stretched across the front gate. St. Mary Community Cultural Center. The gates were open. I walked slowly, my shoes crunching over gravel. The garden was overgrown but still familiar. The statue of the Virgin had lost its shine, but not its posture, still standing tall, arms outstretched, face tilted gently to the sky. Inside, the walls had been painted pale blue. The chapel had been cleared of pews, the altar now a raised platform used for small performances and town meetings. The windows still let in light the same way they always had, soft and holy, even now. A woman behind a folding table smiled when she saw me. "Looking for the art exhibit?" she asked. I shook my head. "Number." "Just visiting." Her expression changed, ever so slightly. "You were here before?" I nodded. She hesitated, then reached into a drawer and pulled out a small pin. It was shaped like an olive branch, simple, brass, worn smooth around the edges. "We keep these for visitors who used to belong here," she said, pressing it into my hand. "To say thank you." Quote. I held it without speaking. After a moment she added, "You're not the first to come back, but you're the first to walk through the front gate." I left an hour later. I didn't take pictures, didn't leave flowers, but I stood by the garden one last time and whispered the names that still lived inside me. Anna, Martha, Eleanor, Joy, and the name I didn't speak aloud, but carried like a scar. His, too. Not for forgiveness, not for closure, but because healing sometimes means saying every name, even the ones that hurt. When I returned to Cleveland, I told the others. Helen reached for my hand and said nothing. Claire smiled gently. Louise passed me a cup of tea and said, "Good." That night, I pinned the olive branch to the inside of my coat, not where others could see it, but where I could feel its weight, where it could remind me that even the hardest things we live through can leave something behind that's worth keeping. In the weeks that followed, we were invited to speak at a conference, a gathering of advocates and survivors. We weren't sure at first. The idea of standing before a crowd, microphones, strangers asking questions, it felt too big. But then Helen said something I won't forget. "If we don't tell it, someone else will. And they'll get it wrong." so we said yes. The day of the event, we stood together backstage, hands linked. No habits, no titles, just 4 women who had once chosen silence and then chosen something else. When they called our names, we walked out slowly. Not to be honored, not to be applauded, but to bear witness, to say, we were there, and we are still here. The stage lights weren't blinding, but they made everything feel too quiet, the kind of quiet that settles between heartbeats. We stood side by side, hands at our sides, no papers in hand, no script to follow. The woman introducing us had stepped away, and all that remained was the soft shuffle of chairs, a cough from the back row, the hum of anticipation before a truth is spoken aloud. I took a breath, looked at Helen, then Louise, then Claire. They nodded not for me to begin, but to remind me I wasn't alone. I stepped forward. My name is Madeline, I said, the microphone catching every syllable, and for many years I lived in silence. A pause. But silence didn't begin in me. It was given, wrapped in scripture, bound by fear, and we wore it like a second skin. From there, the story unfolded again, but not as a retelling, more like an offering. We each took turns, not reliving the pain but recounting the choice to name it, to survive it, to refuse its hold. Claire spoke next, her voice barely above a whisper at first, but with each sentence, it grew steadier, clearer. I thought leaving would make it disappear, she said. I was wrong. What heals is not escape, it's being heard. Helen followed with the steadiness of someone who had already stared down shame and decided it couldn't have the final word. Faith doesn't mean silence, she said. It means refusing to let harm wear a holy robe. Louise went last. She didn't speak long, but every word landed like an anchor. We didn't come here today to be forgiven. We came to remind you that what is buried does not stop growing. It either rots or roots. After we finished, the room stayed quiet, not out of discomfort, but reverence. Then came applause, slow, rising, not the kind reserved for performance, but for witness, for something sacred being shared and received. Afterward, people came to speak to us. Some just held our hands, others cried. A few simply said, "Thank you," and walked away. But all of it felt real. One woman, maybe in her 50s, told me, "I left a convent in 1971. I never told anyone why. You gave me back my voice." Another, younger, said, "My sister never survived what happened to her, but you made me feel like she was seen." We left the auditorium changed, not lighter, but clearer. That evening, back in the hotel, we sat on the bed with our shoes off, tea steaming in mismatched mugs. No one spoke for a while. The hum of the city floated through the window, buses braking, someone laughing too loudly down the block, the echo of life continuing. Helen finally broke the silence. "We're not going back to who we were before this." "No," Louise said. "And that's the point." Claire looked down at the locket she always wore. I'd never asked what was inside. I didn't need to. Whatever it held, it had traveled with her through every season of this story. I leaned back into the pillows and whispered, "What comes next?" The question hung in the room for a moment. Then Louise answered, "We stop surviving. We start living." And for the first time, it didn't sound impossible. The next morning we flew home. The house welcomed us like it always had, familiar and modest, but something about it felt more rooted now, as if we had brought a piece of ourselves back that we didn't even know had been missing. In the weeks that followed, we received invitations from schools, from advocacy groups, from congregations that wanted to listen. Not all were easy to accept. Some came with politics, others with motives unclear, but we chose carefully. Viverant, a movement. We were a memory turned forward. We were a truth refusing to rot. One Saturday, a package arrived from Father John. Inside was a photograph, the old chapel at Havenwood, but not as we had last seen it. The windows had been restored, the garden cleaned, and at the center, just beneath the Virgin's statue, stood a bench. Carved into the wood were 5 names. Ours. Helen ran her fingers across the image as if it were a relic. On the back, a handwritten note. "The past is no longer hidden here." Louise placed the photo on the mantel, not as decoration, but as declaration. That same week, Claire suggested we start a group, not formal, not bound by paperwork or donations, just a circle. For women, for survivors, for anyone who had lived inside silence too long. The first meeting had 4 people, then 6, then 12. It grew not because we advertised it, but because pain recognizes pain, and healing asks for company. We didn't tell our story every time. That wasn't the point. Sometimes, we just listened. Sometimes, that was enough. One night, after the others had gone, a woman lingered. Mid-30s, hair pulled back too tight, the kind of eyes that scanned the room before settling. She approached me slowly. "I read about you," she said. "A long time ago. I kept the article, folded it into my Bible. I waited. I wasn't ready to speak back then," she continued, "but I am now." I nodded. "You don't have to say anything until you're ready," I said. She looked around at the empty chairs. "I think I already have." Quote. After she left, I sat in the quiet, staring at the circle of chairs. And I thought of how far we'd come from whispers in a cellar to this, from climbing over walls to opening doors for others. The light above flickered once, then steadied. Outside, the moon cast soft shadows across the porch, and I thought to myself, maybe this was what grace really meant, not perfection, not peace, but the space between who we were and who we dared to become. The mornings came softer after that. There was still noise, still uncertainty, still the ache in our joints that reminded us how much time had passed since Havenwood. But there was also rhythm, a new kind, not dictated by bells or hierarchy, but by breath and choice. Every Thursday we hosted the circle. It wasn't something we advertised. Word simply found its way. Women came, some with folded arms and guarded eyes, others with trembling hands that reached for tea before they could speak. They didn't need to say much. They only needed to know we were there, that we understood. One evening, a woman brought her teenage daughter. She sat beside her mother in silence for nearly the entire hour, tracing the rim of her cup with one finger. When the room grew still, she looked up and asked, "How did you know it was time to leave?" The question landed quietly, like a single feather dropping into a pond. Helen answered first. "When I realized fear was no longer sacred," she said. Claire added, "When staying became more dangerous than leaving." I looked at the girl and said, "Sometimes you don't know, you just move." She nodded, not smiling, but something behind her eyes loosened. After everyone had gone, I sat alone in the kitchen. The last of the tea had gone cold, and the sky had turned the color of ash. I thought of that question again, not just when I knew it was time to leave, but when I understood what I was walking toward. I didn't know then that I wasn't just running from harm. I was walking toward myself. The next morning, I received a letter. Not from the church, not from Sarah, but from someone I hadn't heard from in more than 30 years. It was addressed simply to Madeline Carter. Inside, 2 pages, careful handwriting, no signature. I recognized the voice instantly. It was Sister Helen. Not the Helen who stood beside me now, but the other one, the older nun from Havenwood, the one who had stayed when we left, who once handed us a bundle of money and said, "Go." She hadn't written to ask for thanks. She wrote to confess. She wrote of what happened after we escaped, the questions, the silence, how Father Jonas had told a different version of the truth, how some believed him, how others simply chose not to know. She had stayed because she thought it was her only option. "I see now," she wrote, "that staying was also a choice, and it cost me everything I never allowed myself to want." She told me she had read the articles, that she had followed the story quietly, from a small town where no one asked about her past. She ended her letter with a line I will never forget. "You carried us when we couldn't carry ourselves, and that's the closest thing to God I've ever seen in this world." I folded the letter slowly and placed it in the drawer beside my bed, next to the journal, the pin, and the photograph of the 5 of us standing in front of the chapel steps. Some things are too sacred to display. They must be held close, pressed between memory and skin. Later that week, we received an invitation. The St. Mary Community Cultural Center, formerly Havenwood, was hosting a remembrance ceremony, not a service, not a celebration, a quiet gathering to honor those who had passed through its walls. Our names were on the guest list. We didn't answer right away. It took several days and a walk through the neighborhood at dusk before we spoke of it. "What would it change?" Claire asked. "Nothing," Louise said. "But maybe that's not the point." Helen looked toward the horizon, where the clouds had started to break. Maybe going back isn't about the past, she said. Maybe it's about choosing how we stand in it now. Quote. So we said yes. When the day came, we traveled by train. The rhythm of the tracks reminded me of that first ride all those years ago, when I was just 17 and sure I was walking into a life I would never question. We arrived early. The grounds looked different. Neater, brighter, but the bones were the same walkways, the same sloping hill, the same air, thick with pine and possibility. Inside, the chapel had been transformed, not erased, just reimagined. No pews, no altar. But in the center stood 5 wooden benches, simple, unadorned. Carved into each was a single name: Martha, Joy, Anna, Eleanor, Grace. My knees nearly gave out when I saw it. Claire reached for my hand and didn't let go. Helen stepped forward and ran her fingers across the letters. They remembered, she whispered. Louise stood behind us, quiet. They honored what they never had the courage to protect, she said. It's something. Quote. We sat for a while in silence, each of us resting on a bench not named for us, but for the women we had once walked beside, the ones we had carried forward in our bones, their names, no longer buried in memory, now carved into wood, exposed to light. A woman approached us later, young, probably in her 20s. She wore a name tag that read Program Coordinator. I'm so glad you came, she said. We tell your story in our tours. Helen smiled softly. What do you tell them? The woman paused. We tell them it was once a place of silence, and now it's a place of voice. That night, we returned to the inn nearby, the same one where we had first hidden all those years ago. The owners had changed. The walls had been painted, but the beds creaked the same way. The floorboards still sighed beneath our feet. Before turning in, we sat on the porch with tea in our hands and blankets over our legs. The stars stretched wide above us, and for a while, no one said anything. Then Claire broke the silence. I thought coming back would reopen the wounds. And, I asked. They're still there, she said, but they're not bleeding. I nodded, staring into the dark. Some journeys don't lead to healing, they lead to clarity. And clarity is its own kind of mercy. The next morning, sunlight poured through the lace curtains like it had been waiting all night for permission to enter. There was something gentle in the way the day greeted us, the kind of stillness that didn't ask for conversation, just quiet presence. No one rushed to pack. No one checked the time. We moved slowly, as if we knew this day didn't belong to schedules, but to something else: acknowledgement. We shared breakfast at the same table where, decades earlier, we had sat in silence, barely able to look each other in the eye after running from everything we knew. Now, our laughter came easy, not loud but real. Claire buttered her toast with 2 hands, something she used to do when her fingers trembled too much to hold a knife steady. This time it was just habit. Helen refilled everyone's coffee before they could ask. Louise hummed as she folded the napkins neatly beside the plates. And I, for the first time in a long while, allowed myself to lean back and watch it unfold, this simple, beautiful rhythm we had built after the storm. After breakfast, we walked. No destination in mind, just feet moving through a town that once held us captive, then forgotten, and now somehow welcomed us in pieces. We passed the old post office, the bench by the bus stop, the path that led up to the convent gate. None of us spoke, but every step felt like memory loosening its grip just enough to let us breathe. At the edge of town, we found a small bookstore. The bell above the door chimed softly when we stepped inside. It smelled of paper, ink, and time. A young woman behind the counter looked up and smiled with the easy confidence of someone who believes the world can still be kind. Help yourselves, she said. We just got a shipment of memoirs yesterday. Memoirs. The word lingered. Louise wandered toward the back. Claire ran her fingers along the spines without reading the titles. Helen sat on a stool by the window and opened a poetry collection at random. I walked to a shelf marked local authors. My fingers found a book I didn't recognize at first. The cover was modest, just a title in white lettering and a blurred photograph of a chapel window. A Choir of Silence, by Sarah Price. She hadn't told us it was already out in print. I opened to the first page and saw her dedication. For those who whispered before they could speak, and for the women who taught me what voice really means. I called to the others. They gathered around the book like it was a flame. Helen touched the cover. "We're in this, aren't we?" "We are," I said. Claire looked at the shelves around us. "Think anyone ever picks it up and doesn't realize what they're holding?" Louise smiled faintly. "Maybe that's the best part. We bought a copy. Not because we didn't have one, but because finding it in the world, unexpected, made it feel alive." That evening, before heading home, we visited the cemetery. It wasn't something we planned. The car just turned that way, and no one objected. There wasn't a grave for Martha, or Eleanor, or Joy. Not under their true names, but we knew where they rested. Beneath borrowed stones, in borrowed stories, we stood in the grass, wind pressing lightly against our coats, and let the quiet wrap around us. Claire took out a small piece of paper and read a few lines from a poem she'd written weeks before but never shared. Her voice wavered, but she didn't stop. "They called us broken, but didn't see how we carried each other. When the world turned away, we didn't applaud. We didn't need to." Later, we stopped by the cultural center one last time. The building was locked, but the garden gate had been left open. We stepped through. The benches were still there, the names still carved. I ran my hand over mine, Grace, the name I'd taken at 17, not knowing the road it would carry. It didn't sting anymore. It just felt like a piece of me, resting where it belonged. Louise left a small bundle of wildflowers beneath the bench marked for Joy. She didn't say a word. None of us did. As we turned to leave, Helen paused. "I used to think healing meant erasing the past," she said. "But maybe it just means being able to walk back through it without falling apart." We drove home as the sun began to dip, painting the sky with strokes of fire and rose. The radio played something soft. Claire hummed along. Helen leaned her head against the window, eyes half closed. Louise sat beside me, flipping through the pages of Sarah's book without reading aloud. We arrived just after dark. The porch light buzzed to life as we stepped out of the car. Familiar creaks welcomed us up the steps. Inside, everything was just as we had left it: the stack of mugs in the sink, the folded laundry on the arm of the couch, the slow ticking of the clock above the kitchen doorway. We were home, but more than that, we were whole. That night, as I settled into bed, I pulled the olive branch pin from the drawer and held it in my hand. Its edges were smoother now, the metal warm from memory. I thought of the girl I'd been when I first arrived at Havenwood, full of faith, full of questions, full of a longing to belong somewhere that didn't hurt. And then I thought of the woman I was now, still faithful, still questioning, but finally, at peace. Outside, a light rain began to fall, soft, steady, cleansing. I closed my eyes and listened, not for answers, but for the sound of a life no longer shaped by fear. By the time summer settled over the neighborhood, it was as if the walls of our home had expanded to hold more than just us. The Thursday circle had grown. What started as a few quiet chairs arranged in a small living room now spilled onto the porch, then the yard, and finally into the borrowed space of the local library's community hall. We never called it a support group. It didn't need a name. It was a room where truth was allowed to breathe without apology. People came with different stories, some with bruises on the skin, others with scars you couldn't point to on a map. There were teachers, retired nurses, a former police dispatcher, a woman who had once sung opera in Cincinnati before her voice cracked under the weight of silence. They came not for answers but for recognition. They came because they saw what happened when someone, even just one person, stood up and said, "This happened to me." And they stayed because we didn't ask them to prove it. We just listened. Louise always arrived early to set up chairs. She insisted on arranging them in a circle with no table in the center, so nothing gets in the way. Helen kept a small basket of folded blankets in the corner. She never said why, but it became a comfort to men reaching for warmth in the middle of their truth. Claire made tea and left a stack of poems near the door, some hers, some anonymous. She believed words should be free, like light through stained glass. And me, I took notes, not names, not details, just moments, phrases, the kind that linger after the room empties. One evening, a woman stood up and said, "I haven't spoken to anyone in my family in 15 years. I didn't think anyone would believe me, but I heard your story, and now I think maybe, just maybe, I can call my sister." Another said, "I used to pray every night to forget. Now I pray not to be afraid to remember. Those nights were holy, in the truest sense. Not quiet, not polished, but sacred in their honesty. Still, outside those walls, not everything changed. The world moved at its usual pace. News cycles shifted. New stories took the spotlight. Sometimes I wondered if people forgot what we fought for. But then a letter would come, addressed in careful handwriting, often with no return address. Inside would be just a sentence or two. I told my daughter, I never had before. I left him. I didn't go back. I lit a candle with your name in my heart. They reminded me that movements don't need to be televised to be real. They can begin in quiet places, like the trembling of a hand across a table, or the first breath taken after years of holding it in. Then, one day, something unexpected arrived. An invitation. It was from the diocese, not from anyone we had spoken to before. The letter was formal but not cold. They were organizing a listening session, part of a new initiative, they said, to reconcile with survivors and examine the failures of the institution. There would be clergy present, and community members, and they wanted us there. Not to testify, not to relive, but to be present, to speak if we wished. We read it aloud, seated around the kitchen table, just like the old days. Claire shook her head. Feels like a trap. Helen said, maybe, but traps lose power when you name them. Guy. Louise asked, do they want healing? Or just headlines? We didn't know. But we decided to go anyway. Not because we trusted them, but because we trusted ourselves now. We arrived early. The hall was tall, wood-paneled, echoing even the lightest footsteps. The chairs were arranged in neat rows, and a table at the front held a pitcher of water and microphones. But this time, we didn't feel small. People greeted us with nods, some with guarded smiles. There were familiar faces, Father John among them, standing with his arms loosely folded, his gaze steady. He nodded once, not as a priest but as a witness. When the moderator introduced us, no titles were used, just our names. Helen stood first. Her words were brief but deliberate. I don't speak for everyone. I speak for myself. But I want you to know it wasn't just what happened. It was the silence that followed. That's what did the lasting harm. Louise followed. She didn't look at the audience as she spoke. She looked down, at her own hands. I'm not here for closure. I don't need that. I'm here to remind you that listening is not a substitute for change. Claire stood next. Her voice trembled only once. I forgave myself before I forgave anyone else. And that was the hardest part. Then it was my turn. I took a deep breath and stepped to the front of the room. I came here not expecting justice. That came late and quietly. But I came to offer this, a glimpse of what survival looks like when women are believed. We were forgotten once. Now we are remembered, and no one gets to decide what that means except us. I didn't wait for applause. I returned to my seat, feeling the weight in my chest ease. Afterward, people came to speak to us, not all with words. Some just with tears. Others with touch. An older priest whispered, I'm sorry. A young woman mouthed, thank you. A man in his 60s took off his glasses, wiped his eyes and said, I didn't know. I should have known. It didn't fix what had been broken. But it made room. A week later, we held our Thursday circle outdoors for the first time. The sky was clear, the air warm, and the chairs scattered across the grass in soft arcs. Children played at the edge of the park. A dog barked from a nearby porch. Someone had brought a guitar. Another had baked muffins. It didn't feel like recovery. It felt like continuation. And somewhere between the tea and the sunlight and the laughter that came without permission, I realized something I hadn't dared believe before. We were no longer just survivors. We were leaders. We were storytellers. We were builders of spaces where pain could be named and not feared. And though our voices had once been used only in whispers, they now carried with them a strength that didn't need volume to be heard. The rhythm of our lives didn't slow after the listening session. If anything, it deepened like a river, no longer rushing to escape its banks, but learning how to carry its weight with quiet force. Each day wasn't easier, but it was fuller. We weren't just healing anymore. We were shaping something new. People kept writing. Some letters came from nearby towns. others from places I had only seen on maps: Minnesota, Louisiana, even a small coastal village in Ireland. The return addresses weren't always listed. The handwriting varied, curved, blocky, precise, but the message echoed across them all. You helped me say something I thought I never could. One envelope held a pressed flower. Another, a drawing: 5 women standing shoulder to shoulder, faceless but unmistakable. Some sent prayers. Others sent silence wrapped in paper and ink. We kept every one. Louise began reading them aloud during our Thursday gatherings, her voice measured, never hurried. We placed the letters in a wooden box in the center of the circle, a kind of shared altar, not to worship pain, but to honor truth. One night, a woman from our circle approached us after everyone had gone. Her name was Marlene, mid-40s, kind eyes, tense posture. She said, "I've been coming for 3 months. I haven't spoken yet, but I listen, and I think it's time." We invited her to sit. She began with a whisper. "I was part of something I didn't understand. I was the secretary at a parish in the early 90s. A good job, steady pay. I typed letters for the priest, managed calls. I never asked questions, but I saw things, heard things, and I told myself, it's not my place." Her voice cracked. "I see now. Silence isn't neutral. It's permission." She wiped her eyes, embarrassed. Claire reached for her hand, held it gently. "You're speaking now," she said. "That matters." Marlene nodded. "I want to help. However I can, go on." So we gave her a place. She organized the letters, cataloged them, responded when people were brave enough to leave return addresses. She answered with kindness, always. She signed each note as the circle, never using one of our names, because this story no longer belonged to us alone. The circle began to grow in other ways. A social worker reached out, wanted to train volunteers based on what we'd built. A local college invited us to guest speak at their psychology department. Even a small parish priest, Father Micah, young, wide-eyed, cautious, asked if he could sit in on a session, not to speak, but to learn. At first, we were unsure, but we said yes. He arrived early, removed his collar at the door, and sat in the back. When the evening ended, he came forward and said only this: "I never want to be the reason someone stays silent. Thank you for showing me what listening really looks like." We thanked him, and he came back the next week. And the one after, not as a representative of the church, just as a man learning how to listen. Around that same time, Helen began writing again, not just for herself, but with purpose. Her words turned into essays, reflections, stories. She called them field notes from the edge of belief. They weren't meant to condemn. They weren't meant to convert. They were simply what she saw from where she stood now, at the place where faith and lived experience met. One of the essays was picked up by a regional journal, then another. Soon, people began asking her to speak. She declined the podium, but agreed to read at small gatherings, libraries, cafes, bookshops. She brought Claire along for moral support and Louise to make sure she didn't underplay the truth. I stayed behind most of the time, not because I wasn't willing, but because I had found my rhythm in something quieter. I began teaching again, not formally, not in a classroom, but in small sessions at the library, writing workshops for women who had never written anything before. I called it telling without permission. We didn't talk about grammar or outlines. We talked about memory, about courage, about how the act of writing, even just a sentence, could begin to stitch something back together. One woman, 71, wrote a story about her hands, what they'd held, what they'd released. She read it aloud, eyes closed. When she finished, no one clapped. We just sat in the silence her story left behind. It was enough. Summer edged toward fall. Leaves began to change. Mornings cooled, and with the shift in season came a new invitation. This time, from a city council. They wanted to create a memorial, not just for us, for all who had been silenced in systems of faith, power, and obedience. A permanent marker placed in a small public park beside a weeping cherry tree. They asked us to write the inscription. It took days, many drafts, many pauses, but we finally agreed on the words. They weren't long, they weren't grand. They read, "This ground honors the voices once lost, now rising. May we listen, may we learn, may we never forget who paid the cost of silence." At the ceremony there were no speeches, just names read aloud. Not all of them known, not all of them ours, but each one carried like a prayer, passed from breath to breath. Claire stood beneath the tree after the crowd had dispersed. She looked up at the branches, then said quietly, "I think I can forgive now." "Forgive who?" I asked. She shrugged. "Maybe not a person. Maybe just the time I lost." Helen came and stood beside us. "We didn't lose it," she said. "We reclaimed it." Louise nodded. "And we gave it new purpose." I looked down at the stone beneath our feet, at the words carved into granite, and I thought, maybe that's what healing truly is. Not forgetting, not undoing, but transforming what hurt into what holds, what broke into what binds, what was once hidden into something that now stands in daylight, unafraid. Autumn arrived not with fanfare, but in the quiet way seasons always do when you're not chasing time. The air grew crisper, scented faintly with wood smoke and the fading sweetness of leaves turning. It was a kind of beauty we had learned to notice gentle, unannounced, asking nothing of us except that we witness it. In the weeks after the memorial, life settled into a rhythm again, but it wasn't the same as before. There was a difference now, hard to name but easy to feel. A deeper steadiness, maybe, as if the truths we had carried for so long had finally found places to rest, like river stones settling after a storm. The Thursday circle continued, of course, and with each passing week, more chairs were needed. Some people came just once, others returned again and again. The room changed shape depending on who was there, but the heart of it stayed constant. It was not therapy, it was not confession. It was a gathering of people who had learned that surviving wasn't about what happened, but how you lived after. One evening, a woman named Carol shared something that stayed with me. She said, "I used to think healing would mean going back to who I was before, but now I know I was never that safe to begin with. So maybe healing means becoming someone I've never been, someone freer." No one spoke right away, but her words settled into the room like light. They didn't demand anything, they just illuminated what was already true. That night, after the chairs had been stacked and the kettle put away, Helen stayed behind. She stood near the window, watching the wind dance through the porch trees. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice thoughtful, "about writing a book." Quote. I turned from the bookshelf. "A collection?" She shook her head. "Number A. Full story. From beginning to now. Not just essays, something whole." "You should," I said. "You already have the voice." She smiled faintly. "I think I finally have the permission." We began meeting in the mornings, just the two of us, notebooks open and coffee warm. She'd read a chapter, I'd ask questions, not to correct but to help her go deeper. She was ready now, not just to name what happened, but to reflect on it with the kind of clarity that only comes from having lived through it, and not alone. Around the same time, Louise began organizing monthly kitchen circles. Women, mostly older, some widowed, some long retired, would gather at our house with recipes and stories. It wasn't therapy either, but somehow, it still became sacred. As bread rose in bowls and pots simmered on the stove, stories emerged, quiet ones, whispered between spoonfuls of soup or while kneading dough. Stories about loss, about starting over, about how strength doesn't always look like defiance. Sometimes it looks like showing up to bake on a rainy Tuesday. Claire began teaching full-time at the center. Her classes had grown beyond children. She now taught music theory to adults, people who had always believed music belonged to someone else, someone more trained, more deserving. Under her guidance, they discovered it belonged to them too. "I'm not just teaching notes," she told me once. "I'm teaching permission." That word again. Permission. It had become a thread among us. We'd all once needed it from the church, from the world, from the version of ourselves that was still waiting to be rescued. Now, we gave it to each other freely. To rest. To speak. To change. Then, one afternoon, as the leaves began to fall in earnest, we received a letter that felt different from the others. It came from a seminary, a professor of ethics. He had read Helen's essays, followed the memorial coverage, and now wanted to invite any of us who were willing to speak to his students. He called it a conversation about systems, silence, and courage. It wasn't the first invitation of its kind, but something about this one felt heavier, more intimate, These weren't just observers, these were future clergy, future counselors, future decision-makers. We agreed. The hall was modest. A room of about 40 students seated in uneven rows. No cameras, no microphones, just notebooks, pens, and faces that held both youth and hesitation. I stood first. I don't speak to shame you, I said, and I don't speak to prove anything. I speak so that, one day, someone doesn't sit where I once sat and seen, unheard and too afraid to name what they know. Helen followed, reading a passage from her manuscript. It wasn't a list of what had happened. It was a reflection on what it had cost. Louise spoke about silencio, the kind that comforts, but the kind that corrodes. Claire, at the end, simply said, ask questions, especially of yourselves, and listen to the answers you don't want to hear. Quote, when the session ended, one student stayed behind. She waited until the room was nearly empty, then came forward, her hands wringing the strap of her bag. My aunt left the church, she said quietly. She never told us why, but last Christmas she gave me a copy of that book, Choir of Silence. I read it in 2 days. It changed something in me. I think it gave her a voice, and maybe now I can give her mine. I thanked her, and in her words, I heard the echo of something we had carried all along, not pain, not even strength, but continuity. The story didn't end with us. It was passing forward into hands that were still learning what it meant to hold it with care. Later, as we walked to the car, Helen said, I used to dream of justice as a moment, a gavel, a reckoning. And now, I asked. Now I think it's quieter, she replied. More like a trail, something left behind for others to follow. Quote, I looked back at the building, the windows catching late afternoon light, and I thought, maybe justice isn't loud. Maybe it's something that whispers. You're not alone. You never were. And now you don't have to be again. The first frost came early that year. Thin and silver, it curled along the porch rails and settled into the corners of windows like a breath held too long. We woke to its hush, the air crisp and honest, and knew that the season had turned once more. Change didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt earned. The leaves that once clung to branches now scattered the sidewalks in soft golds and rusts. We walked over them with familiar steps, grocery runs, library visits, Sunday walks with no real destination. But each time, I noticed how our bodies moved differently than they once had. Lighter. Not because the weight was gone, but because we no longer carried it alone. That month, Helen's book was released. The publisher had chosen a quiet cover, just a field of soft gray, a single white bird in flight. The title was hers, What Was Buried. It wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. We held the first copy together in the kitchen. She passed it between us like a warm loaf of bread, letting each of us feel its weight. The pages weren't just hers, they were stitched together from all the things we had once whispered to each other in the dark. Claire traced the cover with her fingertips. You gave it form, she said. Helen smiled. You gave it breath. We hosted a reading at the community center. No podium, no microphone, just folding chairs and soft lighting and people who knew how to listen. Helen read the opening chapter. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the tremble beneath it, the vulnerability of speaking the unspoken, not as testimony, but as offering. When she finished, there was a moment of stillness. Not polite, reverent. Then, someone in the back rose. A young man, maybe mid-20s, clergy collar tucked into his coat pocket. My mother was in a convent, he said. She never spoke about it. After she died, we found letters. I think she would have liked this room. Helen didn't answer. She just nodded once, hand over her heart. That night, we walked home slowly. The streets were lit with porch lights and the occasional flicker of candlelight through a window. The city felt quieter, like it was listening too. In the days that followed, more invitations came. Interviews, panels, bookstore requests. Helen accepted only a few. She was never interested in becoming a voice for everyone, just for herself and for those who needed to know they weren't the only ones. Meanwhile, the Thursday Circle continued, though it had long outgrown our living room. It now rotated between community halls and borrowed church basements, ironically, some of the very spaces that had once turned us away. We brought our own chairs, our own tea, our own rules, and we brought our stories. One night, a woman stood and said, I came here thinking I'd have to explain myself, but no one asked for proof. That's rare. Another added, The first time I cried here, no one told me to stop. That's when I knew I'd come to the right place. There was no need to respond. We had learned that sometimes holding space was the answer. By late November, snow had begun to tease the edges of the sidewalks, not yet settling but promising to return. Claire started humming carols under her breath as she washed dishes. Louise brought home spices and filled the kitchen with the scent of cinnamon and clove. And Helen, always the reluctant celebrant, surprised us one afternoon by pulling a worn box of ornaments from the hall closet. "These have been waiting long enough," she said. That weekend, we decorated the house, not just with tinsel and lights, but with memories that no longer hurt to revisit. A pine cone ornament Joy had made from scraps, a ceramic angel with one wing chipped Eleanor's, a crocheted snowflake Martha once tucked into my prayer book during Advent. We didn't talk about what we'd lost. We honored what we'd found. That Sunday, we received a letter unlike the others. It came from a school teacher in the Midwest. Her students had read Sarah's articles as part of a unit on media and ethics. They had questions, so many questions. But they also wrote letters, dozens of them. We read each one. One said, "Thank you for not staying quiet. I want to grow up to be like that." Another wrote, "I didn't know this happened to people. I'm going to pay more attention now." But it was the last one that made us all fall silent. It was written in purple ink, scrawled in uneven cursive. "Dear ladies, I think being brave is when you tell the truth even when it's scary. My grandma says you're heroes. I think you're more than that. You're real." We pinned that letter to the fridge. It stayed there long after the holidays came and went. By the end of the year, the house had become more than home. It had become a point of origin, a place where people came to begin again, not because we had the answers, but because we had learned how to sit in the questions together. One quiet evening, as snow finally settled over the city in earnest, Claire and I sat on the porch wrapped in blankets. The world around us glowed, the street lamps casting long golden shadows, the snow catching the light like memory. She turned to me and said, "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if we stayed? If we hadn't run?" I didn't rush to answer. Then I said, "Sometimes. But I know we wouldn't be here. Not like this. Not whole." She nodded slowly. "I think I'm grateful now. Not for the pain, but for the path." I looked out into the snow. It brought us back to ourselves. Claire reached for my hand, and that, I think, is the closest thing to a miracle I'll ever need. We thought the story had closed, that what needed to be spoken had found its voice, that the wounds had been named, and the secrets that once fractured us were now just quiet footnotes in a chapter already turned. But then the letter arrived. No return address, no sender's mark. The envelope was soft at the edges, the paper thick and slightly yellowed, carrying the faint scent of something that had waited too long to be found. Inside were three things: a photograph, grainy, black and white, taken from a distance, a familiar convent wall, a shadow climbing over it, no face, no timestamp, no caption, just that single shape caught mid-motion. A small, rusted key tied with a strip of red ribbon, its threads worn thin, and a note. 7 words, handwritten in steady block letters. "You never saw everything, not even close." I stared at it for hours, not because I was afraid, but because I understood. Understood, in a way I hadn't before, that silence isn't always an absence. Sometimes it's a veil, a door half opened, a truth buried not by malice but by time. And still the key sat in my palm, light as air, heavy as memory. That night, I placed it on the table. We sat in silence, the four of us. Claire examined the photograph, careful, as if it might shatter. Louise furrowed her brow, not saying much, but I could see the storm behind her stillness. Helen didn't speak for a long time. Then she said quietly, "There are things we never told, even to ourselves." None of us slept. Not because we feared what might come, but because something had been stirred, something that had never fully settled. Maybe we had mistaken closure for completeness. Maybe we believed that surviving meant we had reached the end. But what if there were parts of the story we never looked closely enough to see? I sat at my desk until morning. The photo to my left, the key to my right, the old journal open in front of me. The first page bore a line I wrote at 24. "If no one listens, I will write it anyway." I had written. I had been heard. And still, there it was. This haunting sense that not everything had surfaced. Not yet. A few days passed. We said nothing to the circle. Life continued. Winter settled in. But the key remained tucked in the drawer by my bed, untouched, but not forgotten. Then something strange. Just before dawn one morning, I woke to the feeling of someone whispering my name. The house was still, cold, but on the back porch, freshly dusted with snow, was a single footprint. Only one. No prints leading to it. None leading away. No one else had been outside. I swept it away. Not in denial, but in quiet recognition. Because some ghosts don't haunt. They return only to remind you. The story you told was not the only one. We'd given names to what had harmed us. We'd spoken for the voiceless. We'd laid down memory like stone. But I began to understand perhaps we had only uncovered what could bear the light. The rest? It stayed just beneath the surface, waiting. I kept the key. I never searched for the lock. And still, I dreamed dreams of long hallways, locked doors, and voices behind them whispering things I couldn't quite make out. Dreams where I walked alone through the convent, only to find a version of myself standing at the end, back turned, silent. One night I woke, breath shallow, heart steady, not afraid, only certain that something unfinished had brushed against me again. Perhaps it was never ours to resolve completely. Perhaps the truest stories are the ones that remain partly hidden because if we saw everything we might never stop looking. We lived, we spoke, we built something from the wreckage, but I wonder now if we mistook the foundation for the whole house. Because sometimes the scariest thing isn't what happened. It's what still might be waiting. Unopened, unspoken, not gone, only not yet ready to be seen. And sometimes in the quiet, I find myself wondering not who sent the key, but whether, when the moment comes, I'll be the one to use it. Or if it will be someone else. Someone new. Someone still searching for the door we never dared to find.